This is something that happens in the movies. My next door neighbors are actually missing. That's a hard pill to swallow.
She was already dead before the sun came up, and the man who killed her, the man who had placed his hands around her throat while she begged him to stop, while she reminded him that she was carrying their unborn son, that same man drove to work afterward. He clocked in. He smiled at his colleagues. He answered his phone. He ate his lunch, and when investigators showed up at his door that evening, he looked them dead in the eye and said he had no idea where his family was. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what happened in that truck, on the drive out to the oil field in the pale darkness of an August morning. Two little girls, 4 years old and 3 years old, sat in the back seat, very much alive, holding on to each other. Their mother's body was on the floor beneath them, wrapped in a sheet. And their father, the man they trusted more than anyone on earth, was behind the wheel, already decided, already knowing what he was going to do when they got there. He just hadn't done it yet. One of those little girls called out to him on that drive. She said, "Daddy." We know this because he told investigators himself years later, in a prison in Wisconsin, with no visible emotion on his face. What she said after that word, what her last words to him were, will stay with every single person who has ever worked this case for the rest of their lives. And it will stay with you too, after today. This is not a story about a monster who hid in the shadows. This is a story about a man who coached his daughter's soccer team. A man who posted family photos online. A man who stood in front of television cameras and cried, or tried to, while his wife and children were already gone. This is a story about the most terrifying kind of evil, the kind that looks exactly like a good husband and a loving father. Before we go any further, a warning. This case contains details of extreme violence against a pregnant woman and 2 very young children. The content ahead is deeply disturbing. If you are sensitive to topics involving harm to children, please take a moment before continuing. We cover these stories not to sensationalize, but to make sure the victims are never forgotten. If this is your first time here, welcome to Revealing Untold Crimes, the channel where no case gets buried and no victim gets reduced to a headline. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We have viewers from every corner of the globe, and every single one of you is part of why we keep going. Now, let's talk about what really happened inside that house in Frederick, Colorado, on the last night the Watts family was ever whole. Just after 5 in the morning, August 13th, 2018, Frederick, Colorado. A quiet suburb 30 miles north of Denver, built on flat prairie land where fast-growing subdivisions sit alongside oil drilling rigs, and the streets are clean, and the neighbors know each other by name. The Windham Hill neighborhood is still dark at this hour, the kind of dark that belongs to the space before the world starts moving. But one man on Saratoga Trail is already moving. His name is Christopher Lee Watts. He is 33 years old, and what he is doing in these early morning hours, while his neighborhood sleeps, is something that will take investigators less than 48 hours to unravel, and the rest of the world a lifetime to understand. He brings his truck around, backs it into his own garage. That is the first thing worth paying attention to, because he never parks that way. Every neighbor on the street will later confirm it. He always parks on the street, always has, but not this morning. This morning, the truck goes into the garage. The door comes down. Across the street, mounted on the front of a neighbor's house, a security camera is recording. It has been there for a while. It is aimed directly at the Watts driveway. Christopher Watts does not appear to consider it. Later, investigators would find out that he actually knew about that camera. He knew it was there, and yet he proceeded. Over the next several minutes, the camera picks up motion. He moves between the garage and the driver's side of the truck, back and forth, carrying things. The angle of the lens is positioned in a way that makes it impossible to see precisely what he is loading into the cab. He has positioned the truck so that the bed partially blocks the camera's line of sight. He has also, at some point during these minutes, turned off an exterior light that had been shining in the direction of a neighbor's window across the road. He tells anyone who later asks that he was loading tools, work equipment, a lunchbox, things he needed for a busy day on the oil field. That is the explanation he offers, and he offers it several times to several different people in the hours that follow. At approximately 5:46 in the morning, according to the GPS telematics data later recovered from his work truck, he turns on the headlights. Shortly after, the truck leaves the driveway and turns left onto Steeple Rock Drive, the shortest route out of the neighborhood, the route that takes him away from the direct view of the security camera. No one else leaves the house. He drives 40 miles north to a remote oil field site called Survey 319, operated by Anadarko Petroleum, the company where he works. Geotab tracking data would later confirm he arrived at the site at 6:53 in the morning. He stays for more than 2 hours. At 7:18, he uses his personal phone to take a photograph of his laptop screen and sends it to a woman named Nicole Kessinger. The metadata on the image confirms he is at the Survey 319 coordinates when he takes it. He is sending her proof that he is at work. She is not his wife. Later that morning, Nicole Kessinger will tell investigators that Chris had asked to FaceTime her that day. She will say the conversation made her uncomfortable, not because of anything he said exactly, but because in the background of the frame, she could see his bed, and the sheets were missing from it. She knew that was odd. She did not yet know why she should trust that instinct. His wife, Shanann, is 15 weeks pregnant with their third child. She arrived home from a business trip to Arizona at 1:48 in the morning, less than 4 hours before that truck backed into the garage. She had walked through the front door of this house while it was still the middle of the night. Security camera footage would later confirm it. By mid-morning on August 13th, she has missed a prenatal appointment. She is not answering her phone. She is not responding to texts. She is not responding to anything at all. Something happened in that house in the hours between 1:48 and 5:46. What exactly? That answer comes later. But to understand it fully, you need to know who these people were and what was really building inside that house long before August 13th arrived. Before we go any further, a brief warning. This case involves the deaths of a pregnant woman and 2 very young children. The content that follows is handled with care, but it is serious, and it is not easy. If you are in a sensitive place right now, take a moment before continuing. Welcome to Revealing Untold Crimes, the channel where every case is handled with the depth and accuracy it deserves, and every victim is more than a headline. If you are new here, subscribe now so you do not miss a single case, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. We have viewers in over 50 countries, and every one of you matters to this community. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. He was, by every external measure, an unremarkable man, and that is not an insult. It is simply the most honest thing anyone who knew him could say. He was quiet. He was helpful. He was easy to get along with. Colleagues at Anadarko Petroleum described him as the kind of person you could rely on to fix things without making a fuss about it. Neighbors in the Windham Hill subdivision said he was friendly. He waved. He kept his yard clean. He did not cause problems. He had worked as a mechanic before transitioning into oil field operations. He had recently been promoted from a rover position, which kept him out in the field for most of the day, to field coordinator, which moved him into the office environment. On paper, it looked like a man whose career was progressing. His neighbor, Nathaniel Trinastich, the man whose security camera would later become the anchor of the entire investigation, described the Watts family to investigators as a normal, everyday American family. He said Shanann was always really friendly, that she had come over to welcome them to the neighborhood, that the girls were always running around laughing and having a great time. But when it came to Chris, Trinastic offered something else, something that did not make the social media posts or the neighborhood impression. He told police in body cam footage recorded that same day that Chris was real quiet, that there were times he just did not want to wave or say anything. And then Trinastich said something that investigators noted carefully. He told them he had heard the couple before, heard them full out screaming at each other at the top of their lungs. He said Chris gets crazy. Those were his exact words, given to police on the same afternoon Shanann and the girls were reported missing. That detail had never made it into the picture that most people saw. The picture most people saw was the one Shanann herself had built, on Facebook, on Instagram, in video after video. Chris the devoted husband. Chris the great dad. Chris the Rock. He was married to Shanann Watts, the mother of his 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant again, with a boy they had already named Nico. The family owned a 5-bedroom home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. They had 2 working parents, 2 daughters, who knew how to make a whole yard smile just by running into it, and a 3rd child already named and already expected. From any angle you cared to look at them, they were ordinary. They were stable. They were fine. That is precisely what made what came next so difficult to process. Not because the evidence was complex, but because the man at the center of it had spent years making sure no one would ever look closely enough to find it. Here is what the official discovery documents, more than 2,000 pages of case evidence released by the Weld County District Attorney after sentencing. Tell us about the morning of August 13th, after Christopher Watts drove 40 miles to Survey 319 and arrived at 6:53. At 8:26 in the morning, he Googled the phone number for Primrose School. Primrose was the school where Bella and Celeste were enrolled. He looked up the number, dialed it, and when someone answered, he told them that his daughters would no longer be coming in. They would not be returning. He gave no explanation. He simply relayed the information and ended the call. Then, at 8:28, he called a woman named Ann Meadows. She was a realtor. He told her he wanted to sell the family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. He wanted somewhere smaller, he said, but he still wanted 3 garages. Ann Meadows suggested a property just around the corner at 6508 Saratoga Trail, a home built by the same builder with the same floor plan as his own. She told him to drive past it on his way home from work and take a look so she could use it as a comparison to price the listing. Chris said he would. 2 phone calls, calm and practical, administratively tidy, made at 8:26 and 8:28 in the morning, while his pregnant wife's body was buried 40 miles away in a shallow grave, and his 2 daughters had already been placed inside crude oil storage tanks at the same remote site where he had just spent 2 hours. He pulled his daughters from their school. He began the process of selling the family home. He told the realtor he would check out a new property on his commute back. And then he went back to the job site and continued his workday. This is not the behavior of a man who snapped. It is not the behavior of someone overwhelmed by what he had done or consumed by grief or guilt. Those calls were made by a man who was moving on, reorganizing, preparing the next chapter, while the current one was still burning. How long before August 13th he had been planning all of this? That is a question we will answer in Chapter 4. And the answer, when it comes, is one that even the investigators who worked this case said they were not prepared for. By early afternoon on August 13th, a woman named Nicole Utoft Atkinson was out of options and running out of patience. Nicole was one of Shanann's closest friends. She also worked with her. Both were representatives for Lavelle, the wellness company whose Thrive products Shanann sold and promoted through social media. The night before, it had been Nicole who had made the drive to drop Shanann off at the front door of the Saratoga Trail House after they returned from their shared work trip to Arizona. She had pulled up to the driveway at 1:48 in the morning. She had watched Shanann walk inside. She had driven away. That was the last time anyone outside that house saw Shanann Watts alive. Now it was early afternoon on August 13th, and Shanann had gone completely silent. She had missed a prenatal appointment that morning. Shanann was careful about her pregnancy. She would not have simply forgotten it. Nicole had called her. She had texted her. She had come to the front door and knocked. She had reached out to mutual friends and asked them to try. Nobody could get a response from Shanann. Then there was the car. Shanann's car was sitting in the garage. The car seats belonging to Bella and Celeste were still installed inside it. The girls' shoes, the ones they wore every single day without exception, were beside the front door. Shanann's own shoes, the pair she wore constantly, were there too. If she had packed up and left with the girls, she had done it without her car, without her daughter's car seats, and without any of their shoes. Before calling the police, Nicole called Chris. He told her that Shanann had probably gone on a play date with the girls and was likely still at her friend's house. When Nicole told him she was going to call the police regardless, Chris asked her to wait. He said he was about 45 minutes away and would head home right then. He asked her to hold off until he got there. Nicole called the Frederick Police Department anyway. At approximately 1:40 in the afternoon, Officer Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department responded to the call. He met Nicole and her son outside the house on Saratoga Trail. Together, they tried to look through the windows and check the perimeter. There were no sounds coming from inside. No movement, no voices, no sign of children. Chris arrived while they were still outside. He pulled up, introduced himself to the officer, and was cooperative from the first moment. He gave consent to search the house without hesitation. He walked Officer Coonrod through the rooms and answered every question put to him. What Officer Coonrod found inside that house made the situation increasingly difficult to explain away. Shanann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Inside it were her car keys, her lupus medication, a condition she managed carefully and consistently, and a medical device that stopped Officer Coonrod cold, an EpiPen. Celeste, the younger daughter, had a serious and documented nut allergy. The EpiPen was not a precaution Shanann carried occasionally. It went with her everywhere, every time she left the house with Celeste. It was non-negotiable, and it was sitting on the counter. Shanann's phone was found between the cushions of the living room sofa. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand beside the bed. The girls' car seats were in the car in the garage. Their shoes were by the door. Nothing had been packed. There was no sign of a bag taken, no drawers pulled open, no closet disturbed. Shanann had not prepared to go anywhere. Everything that constituted her daily life, her medication, her transport, her children's safety equipment, her means of communication, her identification, was still inside this house. And then there was the one detail that stood apart from everything else. Officer Coonrod noticed it during the walkthrough of the master bedroom. The room was neat. The bed was made, more or less. But the top sheet, the sheet that should have been on the bed, was gone. In a home that was otherwise immaculately kept, in a bedroom where everything else was in its place, one sheet was simply missing. There was no obvious explanation for it. Chris did not offer one. That missing sheet would turn out to matter more than almost anything else investigators found that day. Cadaver dogs were brought through the property. They did not alert inside the house. There were no signs of a physical struggle anywhere. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, no damaged furniture, no signs that the space had been disturbed by a violent confrontation. Whatever had happened here, it had not left the kind of visible wreckage that most crime scenes leave behind. This house was clean, controlled, ordered. Officer Coonrod documented all of it. The purse, the phone, the medication, the EpiPen, the wedding ring, the car seats, the shoes, the missing sheet, and the husband, who had arrived at the scene composed, cooperative, and helpful, who answered every question and offered every explanation, and who, when asked whether he and Shanann had been experiencing any marital difficulties, confirmed that yes, they had been having problems. They had discussed a separation. They had talked about putting the house on the market, but he did not know where she was. He told Officer Coonrod he had last seen Shanann that morning when he left for work around 5:15. She had still been in bed. The girls had been in their rooms. She had mentioned something about taking the kids to a friend's house later that day. And then he had driven away for work, and that was the last he had heard from her. He said he had no idea where they were. He was standing in a house full of his missing pregnant wife's belongings, answering questions from a police officer with a calm face and a steady voice. The Frederick Police Department contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the CBI. The FBI was also notified and asked to assist. A neighborhood canvass was launched immediately. Investigators fanned out to speak with residents and reach out to local businesses for any available surveillance footage. An endangered missing alert was issued for Shanann Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. What had begun as a welfare check was now something else entirely. And in the neighbor's living room across the street, Nathaniel Trinastich was setting up his television to show investigators and Chris Watts exactly what his security camera had recorded in the dark just after 5 in the morning. Chris stood in that room watching the footage play back on the screen, and the investigators watching him said the same thing afterward, independently of each other. He was not watching it the way a man watches footage when he is desperate to find his missing family. He glanced at the screen. He looked at his phone. He looked away. He looked back. He spoke only when the footage showed something he wanted to address, and what he wanted to address was the absence of other vehicles. He kept pointing out that no other cars had come through, that no one else had approached the house. He was not looking for Shanann. He was managing what the camera had already caught. After Chris left the room, Nathaniel Trinastich turned to the officer and said what he had already been thinking since the moment he heard the family was missing. He said, "I just do not understand why he keeps explaining himself over and over. He does not look worried. He looks like he is trying to cover his tracks." The house was clean. There was no sign of a struggle. Shanann's entire life was sitting exactly where she had left it, untouched and undisturbed. Bella and Celeste were nowhere, and the last person to have seen all three of them alive had just walked out of the neighbor's living room after spending more time staring at his phone than at the footage that might tell him where his family had gone. He said he had no idea where they were, but the camera had already told a different story, and the investigators who watched him watch that footage knew, in the quiet of that room, that the answers were not going to come from Christopher Watts volunteering them. They were going to have to pull every one of them out. Shanann Catherine Rzucek was born on January 10, 1984, in New Jersey. She did not grow up there. Her family put down roots in Aberdeen, North Carolina, a small town in Moore County, where the pace is slower and the connections between people run deep. Aberdeen is the kind of place where your neighbors remember your name and your mother's name and your grandmother's name, and where family is not just a word but a structure that holds everything else together. Shanann grew up inside that structure. Her parents were Frank Rzucek and Sandra Onorati Rzucek, Sandy, as the family called her. Her younger brother was Frank Rzucek Jr., known as Frankie, and by every account the two of them were close in the way siblings are when they genuinely like each other, not just because they share a last name. Shanann attended Pinecrest High School in Southern Pines. She was ambitious from an early age, the kind of person who moved toward things rather than waiting to see what came to her. In her senior year of high school, she began dating a fellow student named Leonard King. The relationship moved fast. By the time she graduated, they were already engaged, and not long after, they were married. Some of her friends worried she was rushing, that she was too young and needed more time to find out who she was before committing to who she would be with. Shanann was not interested in slowing down. She was, as people who knew her consistently put it, adamant about starting her life. The marriage to Leonard King lasted several years. During that time, Shanann took on work managing a cell phone store in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and later became bookkeeper and manager for a custom car company called the Dirty South, which had locations in both Fayetteville and Charlotte. She worked long hours. She built skills. She became capable of running complex operations across multiple locations in her mid-20s. But the marriage was struggling. They tried counseling. It did not hold. By 2007, the couple had divorced, and by 2009, the split was finalized. Shanann moved to Charlotte, enrolled in a psychology course at Queen's University, and began the process of rebuilding. Then her health changed the equation entirely. In her early 20s, Shanann was diagnosed with lupus, a chronic autoimmune condition in which the body's immune system begins attacking its own healthy tissue. Lupus is unpredictable. It can be managed, but it cannot be cured, and the flares it produces can be debilitating in ways that are not always visible from the outside. For Shanann, the diagnosis was a turning point. It forced her out of a career she had spent years building, 9 years of work, and then a medical reality that made continuing in the same way impossible. By her own account, the period that followed was one of the lowest of her life. She was unwell. She was rebuilding after a divorce. She was doing both at the same time, and she was doing it largely without the professional identity she had worked hard to construct. It was in that period, in 2010, that a Facebook friend request arrived from a man she barely knew. His name was Christopher Lee Watts. He was from Spring Lake, North Carolina, not far from Aberdeen, though they had not moved in the same circles. One of Shanann's friends had connected them, thinking they might get along. At the time, still navigating life after a divorce and a difficult diagnosis, Shanann did not act on it immediately. But eventually, the conversation started, and one thing, as she herself later described it, led to another. The online connection became a real one. He came into her life at a moment when she had been at her lowest, and she gave him credit for that, publicly, repeatedly, and with genuine feeling, for years afterward. By November 3, 2012, Shanann Rzucek and Christopher Watts were married in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. She was 28 years old. He was 27. They moved to Colorado shortly after, spending their first year in Broomfield before purchasing a newly constructed home in Frederick's Windham Hill neighborhood. The address was 2825 Saratoga Trail. The house was 5 bedrooms, 4,177 square feet, and it cost them $399,000. For a couple in their late 20s, it was a significant commitment. But it was the kind of commitment that fit the life they appeared to be building together. Shanann threw herself into a new chapter. After years in traditional employment, she became an independent representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing company whose product line, called Thrive, consisted of wellness patches, capsules, and shakes marketed around energy, weight management, and overall health. Lavelle's compensation model was built on visibility. To succeed in it, you had to be present on social media. You had to share your life publicly, make your results visible, and make the people watching want what you had. Shanann was exceptionally good at all of it. She posted every single day videos of herself talking directly to the camera, relaxed, funny, and disarmingly honest. Photos of the girls, posts about Chris, updates on her health, her products, her family milestones. She documented pregnancies and school drop-offs and ordinary Tuesday afternoons with the same energy she brought to everything. Her Facebook page became a living, running archive of the Watts family. Hundreds of posts, a continuous record of a life that looked, from every available angle, like it was going exactly the way a life should go. Friends who knew Shanann, and investigators who later went through that digital record, described her consistently and in the same terms. She was always reachable. She was always engaged. She returned calls. She responded to messages. She showed up. Not responding to her phone was not something Shanann did. It was so entirely outside her established behavior that when it happened on the morning of August 13th, the people who loved her knew within hours that something was badly wrong. In June of 2018, Shanann posted a video that she had clearly planned carefully. She surprised Chris on camera with the news that she was pregnant again. His response, captured on video, was immediate. "That's awesome," he said. He smiled. The clip circulated widely on social media. They were going to have a third child, a boy, they would later confirm. They had already picked a name, Nico Lee Watts. He was 15 weeks along, already named, already part of every conversation Shanann had with her friends and her followers, and her mother on the phone. That video still exists. Chris's face in it has been studied carefully by a great many people in the years since August 2018. Whether what he expressed in that moment was genuine, or whether it was already complicated by things happening behind the scenes that Shanann could not see, that is something only he could answer. And his answers, as investigators would come to understand, depended heavily on who was asking and what he stood to gain from the response. Now let us talk about the girls, because this story does not fully exist without them. Bella Marie Watts was born on December 17, 2013. She was 4 years old when she died. The family called her Bells. Neighbors in Windham Hill described her as quiet and thoughtful, the kind of small child who takes the world in before she responds to it. She would wave at people from across the backyard with a deliberateness that made adults feel genuinely noticed. She was 4 years old, and she had already developed a personality that people remembered long after a brief encounter. Celeste Catherine Watts, C.C., was born on July 17, 2015. She was 3 years old. Where Bella was measured and watchful, C.C. was uncontained. She had what everyone who described her called a belly laugh, the kind that started deep and came out loud and filled every room it entered. She was a firecracker. That word appears again and again in the accounts of people who knew her. She ran at life without hesitation and without apology. She was 3 years old and entirely, completely herself. C.C. also had a significant nut allergy, serious enough that Shanann carried an EpiPen with her everywhere, without exception, whenever she left the house with her daughters. That EpiPen was not a precaution Shanann carried occasionally. It was the difference between a reaction being manageable and a reaction becoming life-threatening, which is why, when Officer Coonrod found it still sitting on the kitchen counter on the afternoon of August 13th, it registered the way it did. Wherever she was, that EpiPen should have been with her. And then there was Nico. Already named, already expected, a boy who had a name before he had a birthday, who was already being talked about in present and future tense by a mother who was still making plans and still building things and still completely unaware of what had already been set in motion. The public image of the Watts family was a confident and appealing one. The social media presence, the brand partnerships, the sponsored vacations, the family videos, they told a story of a young couple who had faced difficulty and come through it together. But underneath that image, there was a financial reality that did not match the presentation. In June of 2015, Christopher and Shanann Watts filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The filing was a matter of public record, and the numbers in it were specific. Their total reported debt at the time of filing was $448,820. The mortgage on the Saratoga Trail home accounted for $378,000 of that. The remaining debt, roughly $70,000, came from credit card balances, student loans, and medical bills. Their credit card charges included purchases at retailers like Nordstrom and Macy's. Their combined savings across two bank accounts at the time of filing amounted to less than $10. The joint checking account held $864. In the year before the filing, their combined household income had been approximately $90,000. Chris earned around $61,500 at Anadarko. Shanann brought in the remainder through her work at Children's Hospital, Colorado, where she had been a human resources specialist since 2013. The income was not unreasonable for a young family, but it was not enough to sustain a $378,000 mortgage, monthly car payments, and the accumulated weight of credit card spending that had been building for years. The math had simply stopped working, and the bankruptcy filing was the formal acknowledgement of that. What followed on the surface was a recovery. Shanann built her Lavelle business with determination and consistency. She climbed through the company's incentive tiers, earned a Lexus through the brand's vehicle program, and posted about all-inclusive vacations paid for by the company, trips to the Dominican Republic, to Mexico, to San Diego. She called herself a momtrepreneur. She wore that word without apology and backed it up with visible, documented results. Friends of the couple, including Amanda and Nick Thayer, confirmed that the Watts had been open about the bankruptcy at the time it happened. They had not hidden it, but they had framed it as a chapter that was behind them, one that the new business and the new trajectory had moved them past. Except that in July of 2018, while the marriage was quietly collapsing and Chris was living a double life less than 40 miles from home, the Windham Hill Master Association filed a civil lawsuit against the Watts family for unpaid homeowners association dues. The amount was $1,533.80, filed on July 12, 2018. It was a small number in isolation, but it was not isolated. It sat alongside a marriage under strain and a household that was, in real terms, still stretched. The image Shanann had worked so hard to build and had genuinely earned in many ways was not a lie, but it was a version of the truth that left out the parts that did not photograph well. The gap between what people saw online and what was actually happening inside that house was wider than it looked, and in the summer of 2018, it was getting wider by the week. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. Before Anadarko, he had worked as a mechanic. Practical, hands-on work that suited his quiet and capable temperament. He was not a man who sought the spotlight or demanded to be heard. He fixed things. He helped when asked. He showed up, did the work, and went home. At Anadarko Petroleum, he had worked his way from a rover position, which kept him out on open field sites for most of the day, to field coordinator, a promotion that came in early 2018. The new role moved him from outdoor work into the company's office environment, where he would be spending more time around colleagues, more time in meetings, more time inside. That change in setting, as investigators would later come to understand, was directly connected to everything that followed. The people around Chris described him consistently: passive, non-confrontational, easygoing. He was the kind of person who absorbed friction rather than generating it. If there was tension, he stepped back. If there was conflict, he went quiet. He did not argue. He did not escalate. Almost every person who knew him used the same words. Shanann was the decision-maker in the household. She organized, she planned, she set the family's direction in most practical matters. Chris later told investigators that this dynamic had been fine by him, at first. He described himself as more laid back by nature, someone who appreciated that she took the lead. It had worked, he said, in the beginning. But people who observed the couple in the months before August 13th told a different story than the one Chris presented to investigators. During the family's North Carolina visit in the summer of 2018, Shanann brought Chris and the girls to the hair salon where her mother, Sandy Onorati, worked. A co-worker at that salon named Danelle Search was present during the visit. Search later gave an interview to WRAL in which she said that when Shanann walked into the room, it was like sunshine. She said Chris was very standoffish, that he barely said anything, that when Search said hello to him, he kept his head down and did not respond. Search also said that Shanann's mother had shared with her that there were problems in the marriage and that the couple was considering separation. This observation came from someone who had just been in the same room with them, not from a distance, not from a social media post, but from a brief, direct encounter that left an impression specific enough to recall and repeat to reporters days after the murders. And yet for years, the version that circulated publicly was the one from the Facebook page. Chris and Shanann smiling on vacation. Chris reacting with joy to the pregnancy announcement. Chris described by his wife in post after post as her rock, her best friend, the best dad her girls could ask for. By mid-2018, something had shifted in how Chris experienced the life he was living. He told investigators he had begun to feel like he could not be himself in the marriage anymore. He gave no specific example. He said only that he had been falling out of love, that it had been happening gradually, that he had started to feel the weight of a life that no longer felt like his own. What he did not disclose in those early conversations was the truth of what had been happening. He had not simply been falling away from something. He had been moving towards someone else entirely, and that person had come into his life the moment a workplace promotion put him in the same building as her every morning. In the summer of 2018, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina for 6 weeks to visit her family. It was a longer trip than usual, and it left Chris alone in Frederick for most of it. During those weeks, Shanann began noticing things in her text exchanges with Chris that she could not quite explain away. The warmth felt thinner. The responses came slower, or not at all. The man on the other end of her messages felt distant in a way that was new and that she could not pin down precisely. On July 10th, she texted him directly. "You okay?" she wrote. "It's like you don't want to talk. I kept trying to talk, and I had to dig it out of you." His response, "I'm fine, baby. The last few days at work have put a lot of responsibility on me with new people. I didn't mean to seem short, boo. I love you to the moon and back." It was the kind of message that, read in isolation, sounds like a reasonable explanation from a busy man. But Shanann had been with Chris for 8 years. She knew the difference between tired and distant, and what she was feeling from him was not exhaustion from a hard week at work. She ordered a book from Amazon called Hold Me Tight, a guide to emotional connection in relationships, the kind of book you buy when you believe the relationship is still worth saving and you are willing to do the work. She had it shipped to the house on Saratoga Trail. When it arrived, Chris found it. He put it in the garbage without opening it. He did not mention it to her. He simply threw it away. And then, the night before Shanann left for the Arizona business trip in August, she wrote him a letter, handwritten, telling him how much she loved him and how much she wanted to fix what was broken between them. That letter was later found in the garbage, too. Some of its pages were missing. Shanann confided in close friends, including Amanda and Nick Thayer, who had known the couple for years. She told them what she was feeling. She told them she suspected Chris might be having an affair. She said that if the marriage ended in divorce, she intended to fight for full custody of Bella and CAC. She was not in a panic. She was thinking ahead. She was doing what she had always done, looking directly at a difficult possibility and making sure she knew what her next step would be if it arrived. That statement about custody was made in the privacy of a friendship, in a conversation Shanann had no reason to think would ever matter to anyone outside that room. But when investigators later began reconstructing the events that led to August 13th, it was one of the details they kept returning to. Because what Shanann had said, in passing, to people she trusted, spoke directly to the motive that the evidence was already pointing toward. She had told her friends she would not make it easy for Chris to walk away from this family, that the girls would stay with her, that she would fight. She was fighting for her marriage and preparing for the possibility of losing it at the same time. She was ordering books and writing letters and confiding in friends and doing all the things a person does when they still believe there is something salvageable in front of them. What she did not know was that the man receiving those letters and those texts had already moved on, not in his feelings, but in his planning. While she was writing love letters in the margins of a crumbling marriage, he was 40 miles away at an oil field deciding what came next. And what came next had already been decided. By June of 2018, Christopher Watts had been married for nearly 6 years. He had 2 daughters, a 3rd child on the way, a 5-bedroom house in Frederick, and a wife who posted daily about how lucky she was to have him. From the outside, the picture was exactly what it appeared to be. Inside the Anadarko Petroleum office in Platteville, Colorado, something else had already begun. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She was 30 years old, a geologist and field engineer working for a company called Tasman Geosciences, which held a contract with Anadarko Petroleum. Her work involved environmental and geological field coordination on Anadarko's oil and gas operations, and it brought her into the company's office environment on a regular basis. She was not a direct Anadarko employee. She was a contractor, working alongside Anadarko's staff through a third-party agreement. That is how she and Chris Watts ended up in the same building. Not because they worked for the same company in the conventional sense, but because her company's contract put her there, and his recent promotion had moved him inside. What the official record reflects, and what most coverage of this case has not examined closely enough, is that their contact may have begun earlier than either of them later admitted to investigators. A co-worker at Anadarko told police they had observed Chris and Kessinger interacting closely at the Platteville office as far back as March or April of 2018, months before either of them claimed their first meeting occurred. That detail was never officially explained. Both Chris and Kessinger placed the start of their acquaintance in late May or early June. The discrepancy exists in the case record and has never been resolved. What is confirmed is this: somewhere in the ordinary flow of a workday in June of 2018, Chris walked into Kessinger's office to introduce himself. She thought he was attractive. She noticed immediately that he was not wearing a wedding ring. He did not mention his wife. He told her, eventually, that he had 2 daughters. She told investigators she thought that was kinda cute. They began talking. They ran into each other around the office. They started texting. From that point, the relationship moved quickly. What Kessinger knew, and what she was told, are 2 things that do not entirely overlap, and the case record reflects both with uncomfortable clarity. She knew Chris had children. He showed her photographs of Bella and Celeste early in their acquaintance. She also saw a photo of Shanann on his phone's lock screen. She was aware, from a relatively early point, that there was a wife. What Chris told her about that wife was that the marriage was effectively over. He said they were separated. He said he was working through the final stages of a divorce. He said he needed to find a new apartment for himself and his girls. He presented the situation as a man who had already moved past his marriage and was simply completing the administrative process of making that official. Kessinger told investigators she took him at his word. She had no reason to verify the claim independently. He was, by her description, soft-spoken, a good listener, calm and easygoing in a way she found genuine. She told the Denver Post in November of 2018, "When he spoke to me, he was very soft-spoken. He appeared to be a good listener. He made me believe he was doing all the things that a rational man and a good father would do." What she did not know, what she told investigators she only found out after the family's disappearance made headlines, was that Shanann was pregnant. Chris had never mentioned it. He had acknowledged the daughters, but erased the pregnancy entirely from the version of his life that he presented to Kessinger. When he was eventually forced to address it in one of their later conversations, he told her the baby was not his. He suggested, with apparent calm, that Shanann had been involved with another man. He offered this as casually as someone correcting a minor misunderstanding. He was lying. Nico Lee Watts was his son. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with Chris's child, while Chris was building a relationship with a woman he had told the marriage was finished. In July, after flying briefly to North Carolina to join Shanann and the girls on their family visit, Chris called Kessinger and told her the divorce was finalized. That was also a lie. There had been no divorce filing. There had been no separation agreement. There had only been painful text exchanges in which Shanann kept reaching out to a man who was growing more distant by the week, and a husband who was, by his own later admission to investigators, not sleeping at home for the entire month of July. The dates they went on during those weeks were specific and documented in the case record. They went to a car museum in Boulder, their first official date in late June. They went to the Rooftop Tavern in Morrison. They went to bars and restaurants across the Denver area. They spent time at Kessinger's apartment and at hotels. They were seeing each other as frequently as 5 times a week through July. According to Kessinger's own account to investigators, the relationship became physical almost immediately after Shanann left for North Carolina with the girls. She described the early weeks as intense. On July 28th and 29th, they took an overnight trip to Great Sand Dunes National Park, a remote and striking landscape of towering sand dunes in southern Colorado. They went sandboarding. Kessinger recorded a short video during the trip, in which she thanked Chris for bringing her there and told him he meant a lot to her. That video, along with over 100 photographs of Kessinger, some of them intimate, was later recovered from Chris's phone. He had stored all of it inside an application called Secret Calculator. The Secret Calculator was one of the most deliberate choices Chris made during the affair. It was an application designed to appear, to anyone who glanced at his phone, as an ordinary functional calculator. There was nothing unusual about its icon, nothing distinguishing about its appearance. But it was not a calculator. Behind the interface, accessible only by entering a 4-digit passcode, it functioned as a private vault, a messaging platform and media storage tool completely invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. Chris had installed it specifically for this purpose. He used it to store the photographs and videos from the Great Sand Dunes trip, nude images of Kessinger, text exchanges, and other communications he needed to keep out of reach of anyone who might pick up his phone. The Secret Calculator was not a casual download. It was infrastructure. It was the kind of thing you install when you are not planning to stop. Throughout the affair, Chris paid for their dates, primarily using gift cards. Kessinger confirmed this to investigators, telling them he always paid with those. Always. The practice was deliberate. Gift cards left no traceable charge on the joint bank account that Shanann monitored. Paying cash or with gift cards meant no credit card alert, no line item on a statement, no evidence of a dinner for 2 where a dinner for 1 was expected. That pattern held for most of the summer, until August 11th. On the evening of August 11th, 2018, 2 nights before the murders, Chris took Kessinger to the Lazy Dog Sports Bar and Grill in Erie, Colorado, and this time he did not pay with a gift card. He paid with a personal credit card linked to the shared Watts family bank account. The charge was over $60. Shanann, in Arizona for a work trip, received the account alert. She Googled the Lazy Dog menu that same day, according to page 1919 of the official case discovery documents, trying to determine whether 1 meal or 2 had been purchased. She did the math. She knew. That same evening in Arizona, Shanann had dinner with friends and told them about the charge. She told them she and Chris were having serious marital problems. It was, for many of the people who knew her, one of the last conversations they would ever have with her. Kessinger told investigators that Chris switching from gift cards to the joint credit card that night felt significant to her, but for a different reason entirely. She took it as a positive sign in their relationship. She interpreted it as him no longer hiding things, as a signal that he was moving openly toward her. He was done concealing himself, she thought. She read it as progress. What she did not understand, and what the discovery documents make clear, was that Shanann had been monitoring those accounts closely for weeks. She had seen the mounting evidence of a life her husband was living somewhere else. Chris knew she monitored the accounts. He told investigators himself that he believed Shanann would notice the charge. He said he had stopped caring about concealment. He was not done hiding. He had simply decided he was done pretending to hide. The documented evidence of what both Chris and Kessinger were searching on their phones during this period adds another layer to a story that is already difficult to read clearly. On July 2005, Chris Googled, "When to say I love you for the first time in a new relationship." He then Googled, "How does it feel when someone tells you they love you?" His wife was 5 months pregnant. The child they had named Nico was growing in her body, and Chris Watts was on his phone searching for the right moment to tell his girlfriend he loved her. Kessinger's own search history, recovered forensically after she attempted to delete it, tells a more complicated story about what she knew. On July 24th, she searched the phrase, "Man I'm having an affair with says he will leave his wife." She subsequently searched "marrying your mistress." On August 4th, at 12:45 in the morning, she spent over 2 hours searching for wedding dresses. These searches exist in the official case record. They were deleted from her phone and recovered by the forensic data technician. They do not prove she was involved in what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Investigators examined them thoroughly and concluded she had no role in the murders. But they do complicate the portrait of a woman who claimed she genuinely believed that the divorce was already finalized. The searches suggest she had doubts about the situation she was in, and that those doubts had existed before August 13th. She was never charged with any crime. The investigation's conclusion on her involvement was clear. She cooperated fully, but the search history is part of the documented record, and an accurate account of this case requires including it. When news of Shanann's disappearance began circulating on the afternoon of August 13th, Kessinger saw the reports. She began questioning Chris. She asked him what he had done. She asked where his family was. He tried to deflect. He told her he would never hurt his wife and kids. He told her everything would be fine. She kept pushing. It got to a point, she told investigators, that he was telling her so many lies that she eventually told him she did not want to speak to him again until his family was found. His final text to her denied any wrongdoing. She told investigators, "I never said another word to him after that." The FaceTime call she had received from Chris earlier that morning had already given her something she could not explain away. When she accepted the call, she could see his bed in the background of the frame. The mattress was bare. The sheets were completely gone. She asked him about it. He told her Shanann had taken them when she left. Kessinger told investigators she knew immediately this made no sense. She was laying on a mattress without sheets, she told the agent, and the explanation he gave her did not add up. A woman who had left her home in the middle of the night, without her car, without her phone, without her medication, without her children's car seats, had nonetheless taken the time to strip the bed and carry the sheets with her. Kessinger said she knew it was odd. She said so directly. What she did not yet know was what those sheets actually were. They were the same sheets that Officer Coonrod had noted missing during the welfare check that afternoon. They were the sheets that had been on the master bed when Shanann came home at 1:48 in the morning. They were the sheets that Chris had used to wrap his wife's body before carrying her to his truck in the dark. The bare mattress in the background of that FaceTime call was the crime scene, and Kessinger had looked directly at it. After ending her contact with Chris, Kessinger did not wait. She reached out to the Weld County Sheriff's Office before Chris had been arrested, before the bodies had been found, before the full scope of what had happened was publicly known. She walked into the investigation herself, and she told them everything she knew. She sat through multiple police interviews. She was candid, emotional, and thorough. About an hour into her interview at the Thornton police station on August 16th, she broke down. Twice, in the span of 5 minutes. She told investigators, "It wasn't fair to his family for him to have an affair. It wasn't fair to me to have him lie to me and make me think that everything was going to plan. And still to this day, I don't even know what's a lie and what's not." What she provided gave investigators something they had been building towards since the welfare check on August 13th. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke later described her cooperation as bombshell information. She confirmed the full timeline of the affair, the documentation of their communication, the financial pattern of gift cards, and then the joint credit card, Chris's, behavior on August 13th, the missing sheets on the mattress during the FaceTime call, and the specific lies he had told her about his marriage and his family. She handed investigators the motive framework the case needed. She handed them the reason. Nicole Kessinger was never charged with any crime. She has not made any public statement since giving her interview to the Denver Post in November of 2018. She has not appeared publicly. Reports suggest she legally changed her name and relocated, possibly entering a witness protection arrangement, though that has not been officially confirmed. As of early 2026, she has effectively vanished from public life. Whatever she carried out of this case, she has carried it in private and without comment. From Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, in letters written years later and obtained by journalists, Chris Watts offered a very different account of the relationship than the one he had given investigators. He described Kessinger as a harlot, a Jezebel. He wrote that her influence over him was the reason his family was dead. He wrote that she had pulled at him constantly, that she had the power over him, and that had it not been for her, his family would still be alive. In one letter he wrote that God had a plan for his life that involved suffering comparable to what Christ endured, and that his time in prison was part of a divine purpose. These letters represent a complete reversal of everything Chris said during the investigation and during his Wisconsin confession in February of 2019. In that confession, he described Kessinger with warmth. He described the affair as his choice. He placed the agency for the relationship squarely on himself. He did not blame her then. The prison letters are the version produced by a man with no legal consequences left and no one in the room to push back. They are consistent with the pattern investigators documented throughout the case. Every time Chris Watts needed an explanation for what he had done, he found someone else to point toward. He blamed Shanann in the interrogation room. He blamed the marriage in his early interviews. He blamed Kessinger in the letters he wrote from his cell. The affair with Nicole Kessinger was not the cause of what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. It was the environment in which a man who had already decided what he wanted began calculating what it would take to get there. Investigators had the affair now. They had the motive. They had Kessinger's testimony, her documentation, and her account of a man who had spent weeks constructing a version of his life that erased his pregnant wife and 2 daughters as though they were a draft he no longer needed. What they did not yet fully understand was how far back the planning had actually gone, and how much darker it was than the affair alone had suggested. There is a version of this case that most people carry in their heads, a version in which a marriage fell apart, an affair developed, pressure built over months, and then one night in August, something finally snapped. A man at a breaking point, a confrontation that went too far, a tragedy born from a moment. That version is wrong, not slightly wrong, not a matter of interpretation or emphasis. The evidence, the official 2,000-page case discovery record released by the Weld County District Attorney, the toxicology findings from Shanann's autopsy, and the written admissions Chris Watts made in letters from his prison cell all point in a single, unambiguous direction. What happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico was not the product of one night's collision between 2 people in a failing marriage. It was the end point of a plan that had been running in some form for weeks before August 13th arrived. This chapter covers what that evidence actually shows. And because the evidence comes from 2 distinct categories of source, the official court and investigative record on one hand and written prison admissions on the other, it is important to be clear about which is which. Throughout, both categories matter, but they carry different legal weight, and an honest account of this case requires acknowledging that difference as we go. Sharon Cadle was a 65-year-old author and Christian writer who, by her own account, felt called by God to reach out to Christopher Watts after following his case in the news. In February of 2019, just months after his sentencing, she wrote him a letter at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. She was direct in that first letter. She told him she was not writing to tell him he was wonderful or to be his pen pal. She wanted to write a book about his story. He wrote back. After several exchanges, Chris added Cadle to his approved visitors list. She visited him in person. During that visit, he told her he wanted to give her his confessions in writing rather than verbally, because he believed their in-person conversations were being recorded by the prison. Over the months that followed, the 2 exchanged close to 100 phone calls and thousands of words in handwritten letters. Cadle used that correspondence to write a book titled Letters from Christopher, The Tragic Confessions of the Watts Family Murders, published by Dorrance Publishing in September of 2019, 13 months after the murders. The book contains admissions that Chris Watts had never made to law enforcement, to the FBI, to the court, or in any formal investigative setting. They are self-reported statements from a convicted killer to a pen pal. They are not sworn testimony. They are not independently verified in every detail. But several of the most significant admissions in those letters are corroborated by the official forensic record, and all of them are consistent with a picture that the official evidence had already been building. What Chris told Sharon Cadle begins with a statement that reframes everything. He had been thinking about killing his family for weeks. That is not a paraphrase. That is the substance of what he wrote. He described having spent weeks with the thought of what he was going to do running through his mind. He described it not as a sudden impulse or a moment of rage, but as something that had been present for a significant period of time before August 13th arrived. And then he wrote about the night of August 12th. August 12th, 2018, was the day before the murders. That evening, Chris took Bella and Celeste to a neighborhood birthday party. They played with water balloons. They sang songs in the car on the way home. He gave them a bath, made dinner, read them bedtime stories, and sang them their bedtime songs. He tucked them in. He kissed them goodnight, and then he walked out of their rooms. In his letter to Catel, he described what he thought as he walked away from his daughter's beds that night. He wrote, August 12th, when I finished putting the girls to bed, I walked away and said, "That's the last time I'm going to be tucking my babies in." I knew what was going to happen the day before, and I did nothing to stop it. I was numb to the entire world. I had literally taken my kids to a birthday party, played with water balloons, had an amazing time, sang songs all the way home, gave them a bath, ate dinner, read bedtime stories, and sang bedtime songs, and still nothing registered. He knew on the night of August 12th what he intended to do on the morning of August 13th. He had spent an ordinary evening with his daughters, laughing, singing, playing, and had walked away from their beds knowing it was the last time he would ever do it. And he did nothing to stop what he had already decided. That is premeditation, in his own words, written by his own hand, from his prison cell, to a woman he had chosen to trust with what he called his confession. The Catel letters also contain a disclosure about something that happened before August 13th, weeks before, that had been sitting in the forensic record without a full explanation until Chris himself provided one. When the Weld County coroner completed Shanann's autopsy, the toxicology screen returned a finding that investigators noted but could not immediately account for. Oxycodone, a potent prescription painkiller, was present in Shanann's system at the time of her death. Shanann did not have a prescription for oxycodone. There was no documented medical reason for it to be in her body. The finding sat in the official record as an unexplained detail. Chris Watts explained it in his letter to Catel. He wrote, "The reason the medical examiner found oxycodone in Shanann's system is because I gave it to her." He wrote that he had been slipping it into her drinks. He explained his reasoning in plain terms. He thought it would be easier to be with Nickel if Shanann was not pregnant. He said he never wanted that baby. He believed that administering oxycodone in a sufficient dose might cause Shanann to miscarry. He wrote that he tried to poison her with a large dose of it, because what he wanted was for her to miscarry. The attempt did not work. Shanann became ill. People around her noticed she was unwell during that period in the summer of 2018. But she remained pregnant. Nico survived whatever had been put in her system. And Chris, rather than stepping back from the plan, adjusted and continued moving forward. He had also, according to Catel, added Nickel Kessinger to his phone contacts in June of 2018 under a fake name, a specific, deliberate act of concealment that had been in place from the earliest days of the affair. The secret calculator application, the fake contact name, the gift cards, the oxycodone in the drinks. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure. It was the behavior of a man who had been thinking carefully about concealment and about outcomes for a very long time. The official case discovery files, 2,000 pages released by the Weld County District Attorney after sentencing, contain the next layer of evidence, and unlike the Catel letters, this layer is verified, documented, and drawn directly from the investigative and forensic record. At 8:26 in the morning on August 13th, after driving 40 miles to Survey 319, after burying Shanann in a shallow grave near the oil tank battery, and before anyone in Frederick had any reason to believe anything was wrong, Chris Watts Googled the phone number for Primrose School. He called the school. He told the administrator, who answered, that Bella and Celeste would no longer be attending. He gave no reason. He simply informed her the girls would not be coming back. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. At 8:28, 2 minutes later, he called Ann Meadows, his realtor. He told her he wanted to sell the family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. He said he wanted something smaller. She suggested a property just around the corner. 6508 Saratoga Trail, a house with the same floor plan as his own, built by the same builder. She told him to drive past it on his way home from work. He told her he would. 2 calls, 8:26 and 8:28, back to back, removing his daughters from their school and listing the family home, made on the same morning his pregnant wife's body was in the ground 40 miles away. There was no grief in those calls, no hesitation, no sign of a man struggling under the weight of what he had done in the dark hours before sunrise. There was scheduling. There was logistics. There was the calm, methodical work of a man who was already living in the next chapter of his life before the current one had been publicly closed. This is not what a person sounds like when they have snapped. The pattern documented in the official record across the weeks before August 13th tells the same story from a different angle. Chris had added Kessinger to his contacts under a false name in June of 2018. He had installed the secret calculator application, a hidden vault disguised as a calculator on his phone, accessible only by a 4-digit passcode, to store photographs, videos, and private messages that no one else was meant to find. He had been sleeping away from the Saratoga Trail house for the entire month of July, by his own later admission. He had used gift cards throughout the affair specifically to avoid leaving traceable charges on the joint bank account that Shanann monitored. He had stopped using gift cards on August 11th, 2 nights before the murders, and paid for dinner with Kessinger at the Lazy Dog Sports Bar and Grill in Erie using the shared credit card, a charge of over $60 that Shanann noticed and researched from Arizona the same day. He told investigators later that he knew she would likely see it. He said he had stopped caring about concealment by that point. A man who has stopped caring about concealment from his wife is not a man drifting toward a spontaneous decision. He is a man who has already determined that the situation is about to change by other means. The motive, as Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke understood and articulated it publicly after the case closed, was not subtle. Rourke stated that the evidence showed Chris Watts had every intention of starting a brand new life, his exact phrase, clean of Shanann and Bella and Celeste and Nico, with the love of his life, as Chris himself had described Kessinger. That framing, a brand new life, clean, is not the language of a crime of passion. It is the language of someone who had thought about what he wanted on the other side of this, and had concluded that the only path to it required removing the people currently standing in the way. The obstacles were specific. Shanann had told her friends she would fight for full custody of Bella and CECE if the marriage ended. She had said it plainly and with evident intention. A separation or divorce would not have given Chris the clean break he was evidently seeking. It would have given him years of court proceedings, custody arrangements, financial obligations, and permanent connection to a life and a woman he was trying to leave. The pregnancy with Nico added another 18 years of entanglement to that calculation. A third child made the clean break mathematically impossible through any legal or civil route. In the Cato letters, Chris also wrote something that speaks directly to how he experienced the decision in real time. He wrote that all the weeks of me thinking about killing her, and now I was faced with it. That sentence is not the language of impulse. It is the language of someone who had been living with an intention long enough that when the moment arrived, it felt familiar rather than sudden. When investigators later asked him directly why he had done it, in the Wisconsin prison interview in February of 2019, he told them it was just like an anger with Shanann, with everything. He said he was taking it out on everybody who was in front of him that morning. The investigators present that day said afterward that they did not believe that explanation accounted for the full picture. The evidence they had built across months of investigation did not describe a man overwhelmed by anger in a single morning. It described a man who had been moving toward a specific outcome for weeks, who had tried multiple methods to get there, and who had adapted when those methods failed. The sequence of what happened on the morning of August 13th and on the night before it is now documented across multiple verified sources and the official forensic record. On the evening of August 12th, Chris tucked his daughters into bed, knowing what he intended to do before morning arrived. He was numb to the entire world, as he put it, while singing them their bedtime songs. In the early hours of August 13th, before Shanann arrived home, Chris went to the girls' rooms. He went to Bella's room first, then Celeste's room, and used a pillow from each of their beds. That is what he told Cato. The medical examiner's determination of cause of death for both girls, smothering, is consistent with this account. He believed both girls were dead when he left their rooms and returned to the master bedroom. He then got back into bed and waited for his wife to come home. Shanann walked through the front door at 1:48 in the morning. What happened in the bedroom between the two of them, the conversation, the confrontation, the strangling, belongs to the next chapter of this story. Because that is where the investigation begins, and that is where the people who would spend the next 40 to 8 hours unraveling everything described in this chapter would first start to understand what they were looking at. What this chapter establishes, from the official record and from the letters Chris wrote in his own hand, is that none of it began on the morning of August 13th. The plan had been running for weeks. The oxycodone had already been given. The girls' school had been mentally canceled before the call was made. The realtor had already been identified. The next apartment had already been considered. The fake contact name had already been created. The secret calculator had already been loaded. August 13th was not where this started. It was where it finished. Shanann Watts landed back in Colorado late on the night of August 12th, after several days in Scottsdale, Arizona, where she had been attending a business conference with Lavelle, the wellness company whose products she sold and promoted. The trip had not gone smoothly from an emotional standpoint. On the final evening in Arizona, Shanann had dinner with a group of her closest friends and colleagues, including Nicole Atkinson. She talked about her marriage. She talked about the $60 dinner charge she had seen on the joint bank account, the one from the Lazy Dog Sports Bar and Grill in Erie that she had looked up, item by item, trying to work out whether her husband had been eating alone or with someone. She told her friends that things between her and Chris were serious, that she was worried, that something felt wrong in a way she could not fully articulate, but could not ignore either. That dinner in Arizona was the last time most of those women would ever see Shanann Watts. Her flight home was delayed by a storm. She arrived later than originally planned. Nicole Atkinson, who had attended the same conference, drove her from the airport to the house on Saratoga Trail. They pulled up to the property in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. What recorded Shanann's arrival was not a neighbor's camera across the street. It was her own Vivint doorbell camera, mounted on the front of the Watts home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. That camera captured her walking toward her own front door at 1:48 in the morning, carrying a suitcase in her purse, 15 weeks pregnant, returning from a work trip to a house where her husband was waiting. She walked through the door. The camera recorded it. The timestamp was confirmed at 1:48. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke later told reporters that the Vivint doorbell footage was the last known recorded image of Shanann Watts alive. Nicole waited until the door closed. Then she drove home. Inside the house, the girls were asleep in their rooms, and Chris was awake. According to his own later admissions in the Cato letters and in the Wisconsin prison confession, he had been waiting for her to arrive. What happened in that house in the hours between 1:48 and 5:27 in the morning belongs in its most complete form to the account Chris gave in the Wisconsin prison interview and in the letters he wrote to Cheryl and Cato. The detailed account of what he told investigators in those settings is covered in Chapter 7. But the essential sequence, what the physical evidence and his own admissions established, is necessary here because it is what the neighbor's camera, the welfare check, and the television interview were all responding to. Chris told Shanann he did not love her anymore. He told her he wanted out of the marriage. Shanann, exhausted from a cross-country trip and 15 weeks pregnant, told him that if he left, he would never see the children again. According to Chris's own account, that statement about the children was the immediate trigger for what he did next. He strangled Shanann in the bedroom while she was on the bed. He later described it in clinical terms in the Cato letters, writing about squeezing the jugular veins, about her face, about her eyes. He wrote that all the weeks of him thinking about killing her had now arrived at their conclusion. He described knowing, as he did it, that if he took his hands off her, she would still keep him from kissing her. He wrote that her eyes filled. He wrote that he knew she was gone when she relieved herself. Bella came into the room. She had woken up and walked in. What she found there, her mother on the bed, her father in the room, is something Chris described in the Cato letters with a detail that investigators said stayed with everyone who read it. Both Bella and Celeste came in while he was wrapping Shanann's body in the top sheet from the master bed. They asked what was wrong with Mommy. He told them she was not feeling well. Bella began to cry. Celeste started whimpering. He described feeling so mad that they were still alive. He wrapped Shanann in that bedsheet, the only item that would later be conspicuously absent from an otherwise immaculate house, and tried to carry her toward the garage. She was too heavy. He lost his grip on the stairs. He dragged her the rest of the way down. He then bundled her into the back of his truck, covering her face and feet with garbage bags so that his daughters, who would ride in the back seat on the drive to the oil field, would not have to look directly at their mother's face. Bella and Celeste were alive when they left that house. They were in the back seat of their father's truck. What happened to them at Survey 319 is covered in Chapter 7, where it belongs in the full sequence of this story. What this chapter is concerned with is what the outside world was seeing while all of that was unfolding. And what they were seeing, for the first several hours, was nothing at all. Just after 5 in the morning, a motion sensor across the street activated. Nathaniel Trinastich lived directly opposite the Watts home. He had a home security camera installed on the front exterior of his house, aimed at the street and at the Watts property. At approximately 5:27 in the morning, that camera detected motion and began recording. What it captured over the next several minutes has since been viewed by millions of people around the world. The footage showed Chris Watts backing his truck into his own garage, not pulling up to the street the way he parked every other morning, but reversing the vehicle inside so that the bed was enclosed within the garage space and the door could come down behind it. Every neighbor who was later asked about this noted the same thing. He never parked that way. The truck always went on the street. On the morning of August 13th, it went into the garage. Over the minutes that followed, the camera recorded Chris making multiple trips between the garage and the truck. Back and forth, back and forth. The footage was shot from a distance and at an angle that made it difficult to see clearly what was happening on the driver's side of the vehicle. In one portion of the footage, he appeared to be walking backwards toward the truck, a movement that investigators and analysts later noted was consistent with dragging rather than carrying. And then the camera captured something specific, something that was visible even at that distance and angle. Chris loaded a red gas can into the bed of his pickup truck. That red gas can appears in the footage. It was documented in the evidence released by the Weld County District Attorney's Office on November 20th and 9th of 2018, when the security camera footage was made public. It was reported by ABC News, CBS News, and confirmed in the case discovery materials. Chris's explanation for his movements that morning was that he was loading work equipment and tools he needed for a day on the oil field. The gas can, visible, specific, documented, was part of what the camera caught him loading before sunrise on the morning his family disappeared. At approximately 5:46 in the morning, according to the Geotab GPS telematics data recovered from his work truck, Chris turned on the headlights. The truck backed out of the driveway and turned left, heading away from the neighborhood in the direction of Survey 319, 40 miles north. Nathan Trinastich's camera recorded nothing else from the Watts house between 1:48 and 5:46 that morning. No other vehicle arrived. No one else left. There was no friend who came to pick up Shanann and the girls for a playdate. There was no car with headlights moving through the frame in the direction of any alternative explanation. The house sat quiet and dark, and the only person the camera recorded leaving it was Christopher Watts. There was one more detail noted in the discovery documents about the security camera footage. At some point during those early morning minutes, an exterior light on the Watts property, one that had been illuminating the area near the driveway, went off. The footage showed the light present in earlier frames and then absent. Whether Chris had turned it off deliberately or whether it had timed out was never definitively established. But investigators noted it. In a period of time when he was loading his truck in a way he had never loaded it before, the light in the area where he was working went dark. There was also a baby monitor. O'Rourke confirmed to CBS News that there was a baby monitor with video capability in at least one of the girls' bedrooms in the Watts home. The existence of that monitor, a device designed to allow parents to see and hear their children from another room, was part of the evidence documented in the official case materials. Its presence in the house that morning is noted in the official record without elaboration, but its existence adds a layer to the documented environment of those early morning hours that investigators found significant. When the endangered missing alert went out that afternoon, and Nathan Trinastich heard that his neighbors across the street were missing, he came forward immediately. He told investigators he had footage from that morning. He offered to show it to them. What followed was captured on Officer Coonrod's body camera. Trinastich sat down with investigators in his living room and played back the security camera footage on his television. Chris Watts was in the room. He stood near the screen while the recording played, and what the investigators watching him noted, and what the body camera footage later confirmed when it was publicly released, was that Chris was not watching the footage the way a man watches security camera recordings, when he is desperate to find any trace of his missing family. He glanced at the screen. He looked at his phone. He looked away. He looked back. He never leaned forward. He never asked to pause the footage or rewind it. His eyes were not fixed on that recording, with the urgency of a father searching for evidence of where his wife and daughters might have gone. He spoke only when the footage showed something he wanted to address, and what he wanted to address, both times he spoke with emphasis, was the absence of other vehicles on the footage. No cars came through, he said. See, no headlights. He was not pointing out what the camera had caught. He was pointing out what it had not caught, in a way that served the version of events he had already given to Officer Coonrod. After Chris left the room, Trinastich turned to the officer present and said what he had been thinking since the welfare check began. He told the officer he did not understand why Chris kept explaining himself over and over. He said Chris did not look worried. He said he looked like he was trying to cover his tracks. That statement was made by Nathaniel Trinastich on the body camera footage on the afternoon of August 13, 2018, before the polygraph, before the interrogation, before any arrest had been made. A neighbor who had lived across the street from this family for years had watched Chris for less than an hour that afternoon and reached a conclusion that the entire investigative apparatus would spend the next 40 to 8 hours building toward with forensic evidence. Officer Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department had already documented the interior of the house during the welfare check, and what he found there had been building an argument in the physical record that did not require a single forensic test to be disturbing. Shanann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Inside it were her car keys, her lupus medication, and the EpiPen she carried everywhere for Celeste's nut allergy. It was sitting on the counter of a house where Celeste was nowhere to be found. Shannon's phone was between the cushions of the living room sofa. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand in the master bedroom. The girls' car seats were still installed in the car in the garage. Their shoes were by the front door alongside Shannon's own pair. Nothing had been packed. No drawers had been disturbed. No closet showed signs of a bag being prepared. Everything that constituted Shannon's daily life, her medication, her transport, her children's safety equipment, her means of communication, her identification, her jewelry, was still inside this house. And then there was the master bed. The bedroom was tidy. The bed was present, and the remaining bedding was in place. But the top sheet, the flat sheet that belonged on the bed, was gone. In an otherwise immaculate house, that one sheet was simply absent. No obvious reason, no explanation offered. The sheet was, at that moment, 40 miles away at Survey 319, having been used to wrap Shannon's body before she was buried in a shallow grave near the oil tank battery. Cadaver dogs were brought through the property. They did not alert inside the house. There were no signs of a physical struggle anywhere. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, no damaged walls, no signs of the kind of violence that leaves visible marks on a space. The house was clean, controlled, ordered. The Frederick Police Department contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI. A neighborhood canvass was launched. Businesses in the surrounding area were contacted for any available surveillance footage. An endangered missing alert was issued statewide for Shanann Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. The investigation had formally escalated from a welfare check into a criminal missing persons case with what officers on scene were already describing as criminal dimensions. On the afternoon of August 14th, less than 36 hours after Shanann had been reported missing, Christopher Watts stood outside his home on Saratoga Trail and gave a live televised interview to reporter Tomas Hapo of Denver 7, the local ABC affiliate, KMGH-TV. A second local station, KUSA-TV, also broadcast portions of the appeal. He wore a blue shirt. He stood straight. He spoke in measured, even sentences. He said he wanted his family home. He said the house was not complete without them. He appealed directly to the camera and addressed his wife and daughters by name, asking them to come back. And then he said something no one had asked him to say. Without being prompted, without the subject being raised by the reporter, Chris mentioned that he and Shanann had had an emotional conversation before she went missing. He said it was not quite an argument. He said he would leave it at that. He offered the information and then declined to explain it. What he said next, captured verbatim in the Denver 7 interview transcript at approximately the 5-minute mark, was this: "I just want them back." And then, immediately, visibly, he smiled. He laughed. The transcript records both. In the same breath in which he said he just wanted his missing pregnant wife and daughters home, his face produced the opposite of grief. Body language expert Dr. Cliff Lansley, analyzing the footage for the Discovery Plus documentary Chris Watts, a Faking It special, documented what he observed in clinical terms. When Chris said, "I just want them back," referring specifically to his children, Lansley noted that the lip corners rose, the eyes tightened, and the cheeks lifted, a combination he identified as an indicator of genuine pleasure. Not grief, not desperation. Pleasure. Lansley also noted that in the same moment, Chris slung out his left hand, in what Lansley described as a hand shrug, rotating anti-clockwise, then closed his eyes for a full second, and shook his head no, while the words he was saying would have aligned with a yes response. Lansley described this as a cluster of 4 simultaneous behaviors, indicating that there was nothing in that statement Chris had any confidence in, because it was not true. Don Archer, a professor of linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University who also analyzed the interview, noted that the speech pattern throughout was focused almost entirely on Chris himself, his feelings, his apparent distress, rather than on his wife or daughters. There was no matching affect in his voice, she said. The words described despair. The voice carried none of it. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong, who was among the analysts who examined the Watts case publicly on the Dr. Phil program in December of 2018 alongside former prosecutor Nancy Grace, law enforcement consultant Steve Cardian, and body language expert Susan Constantine, noted that cases of this type, what behavioral analysts call family annihilation, are uncommon precisely because annihilators who kill their entire family almost always commit suicide afterward. Chris did not. He gave a television interview. He asked the public for help. He performed the role of a worried husband in front of a camera with his family already dead, and he performed it with a composure that DeLong and every other analyst who examined that footage found deeply inconsistent with genuine parental grief. What the interview did not contain was also noted by investigators. Chris generated no leads. He did not suggest search areas investigators had not considered. He did not ask what was being done to expand the search. He did not demand action. He answered the questions put to him by the reporter, said the words that the situation called for, and returned to a steady baseline between sentences. He was not unraveling. He was not desperate. He was managing. FBI Special Agent Graham Coder had been brought into the investigation to assist Frederick Police and the CBI. He was watching the broadcast with the investigative team when it aired. When the interview ended, his assessment was immediate. He told the group they needed Chris Watts in a room with them, recorded, right now, not after another day of following tips and canvassing the neighborhood. The next morning, if you are watching this and feeling what those investigators felt watching that television interview, drop it in the comments. Tell us the moment this case stopped making sense to you. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes so you do not miss what is coming in the next chapter, because what happened in that interview room the morning after this broadcast is one of the most forensically and psychologically precise interrogations in the documented record of this case, and it goes deeper than almost anything most people have seen covered before. The next morning, August 15th, Christopher Watts drove to the Frederick Police Department. He brought his father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown in overnight from Spring Lake, North Carolina. Chris walked through the front door of that building and told investigators he had nothing to hide. He said he was ready to take a polygraph examination. He was cooperative. He was composed. He appeared confident. He did not know that Special Agent Graham Coder of the FBI and Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had spent the entire previous night going through his phone. They had found the secret calculator application. They had found Nicole Kessinger's contact listed under a false name. They had found the months of messages, the photographs from the Great Sand Dunes trip, the records of the overnight stays, and the full documented history of a relationship he had denied to Officer Coonrod, denied to Nicole Atkinson, denied in his television interview, and was about to deny again in a formal law enforcement setting to the 2 people in that building who already knew every detail of it. Christopher Watts walked into the Frederick Police Department on the morning of August 15th, thinking he was continuing to manage a story. He was walking into the end of one. On the morning of August 15th, 2018, Christopher Watts drove to the Frederick Police Department. He brought his father with him. Ronnie Watts was 62 years old. He had flown in overnight from Spring Lake, North Carolina, after learning that his son's pregnant wife and 2 granddaughters were missing, and that law enforcement was involved. He was a steady, quiet man, and he had come because that is what a father does when his child calls. He arrived not knowing the full extent of what investigators already believed. He arrived because Chris had asked him to come, and because whatever was happening in Frederick, Colorado, he intended to be there for it. When they walked through the front door of the police department together, investigators separated them immediately. Ronnie was taken to a waiting area. He would remain there for hours, not entirely alone because investigators would later confirm that his father never left the building during the entire duration of Chris's polygraph and interview that day. But he was outside the room, away from his son, knowing nothing of what was being said or measured or discovered on the other side of the wall. Chris was brought in and introduced to Special Agent Graham Coder of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The spelling of Agent Coder's first name matters here, because it appears consistently in the official case documents as Grom, not Graham, a detail worth noting in a story where precision has consequences. He had been brought into the investigation from outside the local department. He had no prior relationship with Christopher Watts, no history with the case, and no dynamic that Chris could read or anticipate. That was deliberate. Bringing in a stranger, a trained FBI interviewer with no pre-established rapport, was a calculated investigative choice. Chris would not know this man's baseline. He would not be able to gauge how much Coder knew or how much he was holding back. He would be walking into a conversation with someone he had never seen before, and that asymmetry was intentional. Agent Coder was soft-spoken. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean across the table or begin with accusations. He built. He was patient in the way that skilled investigators are patient, not passively, but with direction. Every question was placed in sequence for a reason. The conversation moved at his pace. He would later be quoted as telling Chris directly at one point during the interview, "We are going to be looking for the man who did this, and you can imagine that we are going to include you as that man." He said it in the same measured, almost conversational tone he maintained throughout. Soft, soothing, as Agent Lee would later describe it, and at the same time, asking very, very tough questions. The first thing Agent Coder did was ask Chris to write a statement. Before any verbal questioning began, before any probing or pressing or follow-up, he had Chris sit down and write a full detailed account of what had happened from the time Shanann arrived home on the night of August 12th through the time Chris left for work on the morning of August 13th. The written statement technique is a standard investigative tool used specifically because it locks a version of events into the permanent record before any probing begins. Once a suspect commits details to paper in their own handwriting, that version becomes the fixed reference point for everything that follows. Every detail they write down is one they will be held to. Every gap is a gap that can be pressed. Every inconsistency that later emerges from forensic evidence or witness accounts is measured against what they wrote before anyone challenged them. Chris wrote his statement. When he finished, the version on paper read as follows. Shanann arrived home from her trip at approximately 2 in the morning. They went to bed. At 4 in the morning, his alarm went off for work. The couple had a conversation, he described it as emotional, about the state of their marriage. He said they discussed separating. He said they discussed listing the house for sale. At the end of the conversation, he said, Shanann told him she was going to take the girls to a friend's house and would be back later in the day. He said he left for work at around 5:15 in the morning. He said she was still in bed when he left. He said the girls were in their rooms. He said that was the last he saw any of them, and that despite texting and calling Shanann multiple times throughout the day, he had not heard from her since. He wrote that down. He signed it. He handed it to Agent Coder, and then the verbal questioning began. Agent Coder worked through Chris's account with methodical patience. He asked about the marriage, about the separation conversation, about what specifically had been said, and how long the difficulties between them had been building. He asked about the girls, their routines, their friendships, where Shanann typically took them on visits to a friend's house. He asked about the text messages and phone calls Chris said he had made throughout the day of August 13th without receiving a response. He was building a picture, establishing what normal looked like for this family, so that everything abnormal about this particular morning would be measurable against it. At a certain point, Agent Coder raised the subject of infidelity. He asked Chris whether he had been having an affair. Chris said no. He said he had never cheated on Shanann in his life. He said he was certain Shanann had never been unfaithful to him either. He said the two of them had a mutual agreement, that if either of them ever found themselves considering straying, they would tell the other one first, before anything happened. He described this as a foundation of their marriage. He said this agreement had never been tested because neither of them had ever wanted anyone else. He delivered this denial directly, without visible hesitation, without any shift in his composure. He looked at Agent Coder and told him, in a formal recorded law enforcement interview with his missing pregnant wife's case open on the table between them, that he was a faithful husband and that infidelity played no part in any of this. In another part of the building, at approximately the same time, something had already happened that made every word of that denial irrelevant. At 8 o'clock that morning, 3 hours before the polygraph examination was scheduled to begin at 11, Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation received a phone call. The caller was Tony Husky, Anadarko's regional security manager. Husky told Agent Lee that he had been reviewing Christopher Watts's computer network traffic and had found something significant. There were emails between Chris and an Anadarko contracted employee. He identified her as Nicole Kessinger, age 30, born July 3, 1988, and said she worked on the geosciences side of the company, helping to survey land. Husky said the emails suggested Chris had started a relationship with her. That phone call, made at 8 in the morning on August 15th, was the moment the affair entered the official investigation. It did not come from phone forensics alone. It came from Anadarko's own security manager, calling involuntarily 3 hours before the man at the center of it was scheduled to sit down and tell investigators he had never been unfaithful. From there, investigators moved quickly. They had already been conducting forensic analysis of Chris's phone. The secret calculator application was found on the device. When the 4-digit passcode was entered, what the application contained was a complete documentary record. Text messages between Chris and Kessinger spanning months, photographs, images from overnight trips, including the Great Sand Dunes trip in late July, images Chris had taken himself, identifiable because his reflection appeared in the background of certain frames, love letters, phone logs, records of communication maintained with deliberate, sustained effort across more than 2 months. Beyond the secret calculator, the forensic review found the contact entry for Kessinger and Chris's phone registered under a false name, not her real identity, but a fabricated name he had created specifically so that her name would not appear on his screen if Shanann happened to look. They found records of the Lazy Dog dinner charge on August 11th. They found months of communication. The affair was confirmed in full. The motive was established. The lie Chris was delivering in the interview room down the hall was documented in real time by the evidence already sitting in front of the investigative team. They made a deliberate decision not to tell Chris any of this yet. They let him keep talking. Every detail he volunteered, every denial he offered, every version of events he constructed was being measured in real time against what Tony Husky had reported at 8 in the morning and what the phone forensics had confirmed in the hours since. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke would later describe this period precisely. He said there was a fine line to walk between employing investigative techniques to get the information you need and going so far that you cause the suspect to shut down entirely. The team walked that line deliberately. They gave Chris no indication that anything had shifted. Agent Coder kept his voice steady, his manner open, and the conversation moving. As the interview continued, investigators monitoring the session documented a series of behavioral details that are preserved in the official case record and that the chapter requires examining carefully. At one point during the conversation, when discussing his daughters and the things they loved, Chris referred to Bella and Celeste in the past tense, not as an isolated slip attributable to fatigue or nerves, but in a pattern. He was shown photographs of the girls, their shoes, their clothing, the things they carried with them everywhere. And when he described what he saw, he reached for the language of memory. She always loved those shoes, he said. The wrong tense. The tense of a man for whom those children were already past. Agent Lee, who had observed the FBI interview before conducting her polygraph examination and who would later describe Coder's approach in interviews and at professional conferences, noted this specifically. Coder had shown Chris a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste, and the behavioral response was immediate. The past tense, the language that did not belong to someone who believed his children were safe and coming home. At no point during the hours he spent with Agent Coder did Chris generate a single lead. He did not suggest any search areas investigators had not already considered. He did not ask what was being done to expand the effort to find his family. He did not propose any avenue of inquiry or volunteer any information that was not directly solicited. He answered what was asked. He offered nothing beyond it. He was not the kind of man investigators typically saw in missing persons cases where the spouse had no involvement. The kind who cannot sit still, who demands to know what is being done, who pushes and pushes because the alternative is unbearable. Chris was comfortable waiting. And then there was the list. Agent Lee, in the final portion of the pre-polygraph interview before the formal examination began, asked Chris to explain all the ways someone could physically make another person disappear. This is a recognized investigative technique used specifically to observe which scenarios produce a reaction and how a subject responds to having the full range of possibilities made explicit in front of them. Chris mentioned hiring someone, a hitman. He said, "I'm just being honest." Then Agent Lee gave him more room. She asked him to list the physical ways a person could cause someone else's disappearance through murder. Chris replied, "Stab someone, shoot someone, hit them with a blunt object." Then he paused. "What else is there?" he said. "I mean, use a weapon like a gun or a knife." Agent Lee added, "You could smother someone. You could strangle someone." Chris said, "You could hang someone. Yeah, all that kind of things. I mean, it's hard to even think about that kind of stuff right now." And then, as the official CBI polygraph report documents in Agent Lee's own words, "At that point, Chris giggled and told me it was a hard question to answer because he had nothing to do with the disappearance." Chris said he didn't like to think about it. A giggle from a man whose pregnant wife and 2 daughters had been missing for 2 days. When presented with a list of ways a person could be murdered and made to disappear, he giggled, described it as a hard question because he had nothing to do with it, and said he did not like to think about those things. Agent Lee recorded it. It went into the official case file. It was later confirmed in the 2,000 pages of discovery documents released by the Weld County District Attorney, and reported by Oxygen from those documents. The giggle is not interpretation or analysis. It is documented in the agent's own written account of what happened in that room. After the discussion of possible methods of killing, Agent Lee said to Chris that sometimes people feel guilty for causing someone to leave, for the conversation that might have pushed them out the door. "That's why I feel like a jackass right now," Chris replied. The formal polygraph examination was scheduled for 11 in the morning on August 15th. When it began, Agent Lee walked Chris through the procedure, how the equipment worked, what was being measured, what the comparison questions were for, and what the process would look like from his perspective. She then read Chris his Miranda rights. He signed an advisement of rights form stating he understood his rights and wished to continue. He also signed a consent form indicating his willingness to undergo the examination. Before attaching the instruments, Agent Lee addressed the subject of the affair one final time. She asked Chris whether he had been involved with anyone outside his marriage. He denied it. For the second formal time in less than 24 hours, Christopher Watts looked at a law enforcement investigator and told them he had never been unfaithful. He said this knowing what was on his phone. He said this knowing what Tony Husky had already reported to the investigation 3 hours earlier that morning. He said it sitting in a chair about to be connected to a polygraph machine. Agent Lee noted his denial. Then she said something to him directly. She told him it would be extremely foolish for someone who had anything to do with their family's disappearance to come in and take this polygraph today. She said it plainly, without theatrics, as a statement of plain fact. She was giving him a door. She was making the choice explicit. If you did something to your family, do not take this test. Christopher Watts did not get up. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for time to think. He sat in the chair and waited for the examination to begin. The formal polygraph examination consisted of 3 relevant questions. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where Shanann is now? "Are you lying about the last time you saw her?" Chris answered no to all three. His voice was steady. He did not visibly hesitate between questions. He gave his answers in the calm, controlled manner he had maintained across 2 days of formal law enforcement contact. Agent Lee administered the examination, then removed the instruments from the room. She took the charts to a separate space to grade them using the empirical scoring system, the standard methodology used by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for polygraph analysis. She sat with the data and worked through each chart collection methodically. The threshold for a truthful result in this scoring system is a positive score of 2 or higher. The threshold for deception indicated is a -4 or below. Between those two numbers lies the range of inconclusive results, the space occupied by subjects who may be anxious or whose physiological responses do not clearly resolve in either direction. Agent Lee would later explain that the system accounts for general anxiety through its comparison question technique, which specifically differentiates between baseline nervousness and the kind of physiological response that indicates deception on the relevant question specifically. A person who is merely nervous about taking a test shows elevated responses to both relevant and comparison questions, producing an inconclusive result rather than a clear finding. That is not what happened here. Chris Watts scored a -18, not a -4, which would have been the minimum threshold for a deception finding. Not a -8 or a -10, a -18, the most extreme result the scoring system documented in this case on every question he was asked. The LeadDetectorTest.com analysis of the official CBI report describes a -18 as extraordinarily far beyond the deception threshold, indicating massive and consistent physiological reactions across all relevant questions and all chart collections. The official CBI polygraph report classified the result as deception indicated, the strongest possible negative finding available on a polygraph examination. The alternative outcomes, no deception indicated and inconclusive, were not applicable in any measurable sense. It bears stating clearly what this means in legal terms. Polygraph results are not admissible as evidence in Colorado courts. They cannot be used to prove guilt in a courtroom. They are an investigative tool, a mechanism for generating information that guides the direction of an inquiry and shapes the decisions investigators make about how to proceed. A -18 did not prove Christopher Watts had killed his family. What it told the investigative team, in the clearest possible terms, was that the man who had just sat in that chair had not told the truth about any of the 3 most important questions they had asked him. It also formally changed his status. From this moment, Christopher Watts was no longer being treated as a cooperative witness in a missing persons case. He was the primary suspect in what investigators now believed was a homicide investigation. While Agent Lee was grading the charts in another room, Chris sat alone in the interview room. He had the space to himself for a period of time, and what he did with that time was documented. He watched videos on his phone, videos of his daughters, Bella and Celeste, giggling and playing. He sat in the interview room of the Frederick Police Department, having just failed a polygraph test on questions about whether he knew where his family was, and he watched footage of his daughters on his phone screen. Agent Lee completed her grading. She walked to where Agent Coder was waiting. They spoke. They agreed on what came next. They walked back to the interview room together. They brought with them a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste, which they placed on the table directly in front of Chris. Agent Lee told him it was clear he had not been honest during the testing. She told him he had not passed the polygraph. Chris replied, "Okay." She told him they now needed to talk about what had actually happened. Chris said, "I didn't lie to you on that polygraph. I promise." Agent Coder told Chris it was time. He asked him to stop and take a deep breath. Agent Lee told Chris she appreciated him coming in to take the polygraph, even though he knew he was not going to pass. It was a precise and deliberate move. She told him what she believed he already knew going in, that he had come into that building on August 15th, knowing the test would reveal what he had been hiding. She was not offering him an insult. She was removing his last available pretense. She was putting the truth on the table between them and inviting him to meet it. Agent Coder reminded Chris that infidelity had not been one of the polygraph questions. He then told Chris directly that they already knew about his girlfriend, Nikki. They named Nicole Kessinger. They did not ask Chris whether the relationship existed. They told him they knew it did. The room that Agent Lee and Agent Coder walked back into was not the same room they had left. Everything that Chris had constructed across 2 days, the cooperative witness, the confused husband, the faithful man with no idea where his family had gone, was no longer standing. What was left was a man sitting across a table from 2 investigators who had a negative 18 polygraph score, a phone full of documented evidence, a tip from Anadarko's own security manager, and a printed photograph of 2 little girls placed face up on the table between them. Chris Watts sat across from all of it, and the conversation that followed would change everything. The room that Agent Tammy Lee and Special Agent Graham Coder walked back into was not the same room they had left. When they had first entered that building on August 15th, the approach had been calibrated to a specific purpose. Keep Chris talking, keep him cooperative, give him no indication of how far ahead the investigation already was. Agent Coder had been patient and measured. The conversation had moved at his pace. The instruments had been attached, the test had been administered, and then the agents had left the room and let the charts tell them what they already suspected. Now they were back, and the atmosphere they carried in with them was different. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was not hostility. That would have been counterproductive, and both of them knew it. What replaced it was precision. A focused, directed clarity that told the man sitting across the table that the portion of this conversation devoted to building rapport was finished. What came next was the only part that had ever mattered. Agent Lee placed a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste on the table directly in front of Chris. She told him it was completely clear that he had not been honest during the testing. She told him he had not passed the polygraph. Agent Coder told him that he had failed miserably on the questions about where his wife and children were. Chris claimed he was a nervous person and that he felt like he would say the wrong thing on every question. Coder and Lee told him that the affair had not been one of the polygraph questions. His secret life could not have been the thing he was nervous about because it had not been asked. The deception indicated on the charts was about Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, about where they were, about what he knew. Chris said, "I didn't lie to you on that polygraph. I promise." Agent Coder told him to stop. He asked him to take a deep breath. Then Coder said something else. He told Chris he had lied to everyone he had talked to, and they had all bought it. He pointed out that Ronnie Watts, Chris's father, who had flown across the country to support his son, was sitting outside this room right now. That his father had come because he loved him, and Chris had lied to him too. After a period of continued questioning, Chris offered the affair. He said he had not wanted to bring a certain woman into this. He said he was not proud of it and had been trying to protect her from the investigation. Investigators told him they already knew. They named Nicole Kessinger. They told Chris they were aware of the relationship and that it was not why they were in the room with him. That information had already been confirmed through Tony Husky's call that morning and through everything the forensic phone analysis had produced. They were not asking Chris to confirm what they already knew. They were telling him they were ahead of him. That whatever story he had been managing across the previous 2 days, the foundation of it had already been removed. The affair was not the thing. It was the gateway to the thing. And both investigators knew it. What followed in that room over the next period of time is an example of investigative technique that is worth understanding clearly, because it is easy to misread if you are not familiar with what you are looking at. Agent Coder and Agent Lee employed a method known as minimization, a documented, established approach used in investigative interviewing when a subject is resistant to full disclosure and needs a psychological pathway into it. The technique involves offering the suspect reduced culpability framings for what may have happened, alternative explanations, suggested justifications, the possibility that a reasonable person in a difficult situation could have reached a breaking point that others might understand, even if they could not condone it. Coder suggested that the marriage may have been one-sided for a long time, that someone in Chris's position, feeling trapped, feeling unheard, carrying a weight of obligation and expectation that had built over years, might have reached a point that other people could relate to on some level. He raised the possibility that Shanann might have been a difficult or controlling presence in the marriage. He suggested gently that something could have happened that morning that had not been planned, that maybe Chris had walked in on something, that maybe Shanann had done something to the girls and he had reacted. This was not investigators believing any of that. It was not investigators suggesting that Shanann bore any responsibility for what had happened in that house. It was a strategic communication technique designed to accomplish one specific thing: lower Chris's psychological defenses enough to get him talking about the actual events. The goal was not agreement. The goal was disclosure. People who have committed serious crimes are more likely to begin speaking when they are offered a framing in which some portion of the weight can be attributed elsewhere. Chris responded to the framing. He began to suggest that Shanann had harmed the girls, that he had walked in on her doing something to Celeste, that he had reacted to what he found, that what followed was the action of a man responding to something unimaginable. He was constructing a false narrative in real time, assembling a version of events in which Shanann was the initiator of violence and he was the reactor, in which the woman who could no longer speak was assigned the action that set everything in motion. Investigators recognized the construction. They had seen it before. They did not challenge it directly. They did not expose its contradictions in the room. They let him build it, knowing that the autopsy findings would dismantle it completely when the time came. And then Chris made the request that stopped the room. He asked to speak to his father. What followed from that request was one of the most consequential split-second decisions of the entire investigation. Agent Coder and Agent Lee had seconds to respond. There was no time to call a supervisor or consult with the Weld County District Attorney's office. The request was in the room, and the answer had to be in the room immediately. The risk of saying yes was specific and severe. Ronnie Watts was a 62-year-old father who had flown across the country to support his son. He had been sitting in a waiting area for hours. If he walked into that room and saw Chris under the pressure that was visible in that space at that moment, his protective instinct might override everything else. He might tell his son to ask for a lawyer, and the moment those words were spoken, by Ronnie or by anyone else in that room, the interview would be over. Chris would invoke his right to counsel, and the entire investigation would shift onto the forensic evidence without a confession, without directions to where the bodies were, without a man telling them himself what had happened and where his family could be found. The risk of saying no was that it might harden Chris's resistance at the precise moment he was closest to breaking. Agent Coder and Agent Lee looked at each other. They agreed. They stepped out of the room and walked directly to the observation area to watch. Ronnie Watts came through the door of the interrogation room. He was wearing a polo shirt embroidered with the words, Papa Ronnie. That detail is documented in the official case discovery file. When Ronnie walked in, Chris stood up and they embraced. Father and son, in the interrogation room of the Frederick Police Department, holding each other while investigators watched in silence from the other side of the glass. Then they sat down. Ronnie's manner was soft-spoken. He rested his forehead in one hand at certain points. His son sat with his head down, tensed up, speaking quietly. What Chris said to his father was captured on both audio and video recording. The conversation was monitored from the observation room, and what came out of Chris's mouth in those minutes was the false narrative he had been building in the interrogation room, but spoken now to his own father about his father's own grandchildren. Chris whispered to Ronnie. She smothered them. They were smothered. He then said, When I was downstairs, I came back up and they were gone. He said he heard a little commotion upstairs and went up to find his wife on top of their daughter Celeste, choking her. He said he saw Bella, already blue, sprawled out on her bed. He said he talked to Shanann about the separation and about everything, and he didn't know what else to say. And then he said, 'Cause I freaked out, and I did the same thing to her. Those were my kids. Ronnie wiped his hand over his face. Then he said, Good God Almighty, son. He sat with his boy. He did not tell Chris to ask for a lawyer. He listened. At certain points, according to the documentary record, Ronnie appeared to search for explanations, even suggesting to investigators afterward that Shanann had possibly planned to hurt the girls based on a photograph he had seen on Facebook in which a doll in the house had been covered with a sheet. He said he had never seen Bella cover anything that way before. He was a man trying to find a framework for something that had no acceptable framework. Agent Lee later described watching through the observation glass as one of the most gut-wrenching experiences of the investigation. She was watching a father hear a fabricated account of how his grandchildren had died from the man who had killed them. She knew it was false. She knew the forensic evidence that was coming would prove it was false. But the specific weight of watching that dynamic, A father and son in a room together around a story constructed to shift blame onto a dead woman was something that stayed with her. When the conversation ended, investigators re-entered the room without delay. The priority now had a single focus: location. Chris had acknowledged that Shanann was dead. He had described what he said happened. The false narrative was on the table, but what no forensic analysis or satellite imaging or canvassing of the neighborhood could tell investigators with the speed they needed was where the bodies were. Only Chris could give them that, and they needed it now. Back in the interrogation room, investigators pressed him on location. Where are they? Chris gave them the specific account he had settled on. He said he had seen Shanann on the baby monitor, strangling Celeste in the girl's room. He said he found Bella already blue and sprawled on her bed, apparently dead. He said he went into a rage and strangled Shanann. Then he said he loaded all 3 bodies onto the back seat of his work truck and drove to an oil field. He directed them to Survey 319, the Anadarko petroleum oil field site, approximately 40 miles north of Frederick, where he worked. He told them Shanann was buried near the site. He told them the girls were in the oil tanks. He marked the locations of the bodies on a photograph of the oil field that investigators placed in front of him. Watts was formally placed under arrest at 11:30 in the evening on August 15, 2018. 3 counts of first-degree murder. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He was handcuffed, taken to a patrol car, and transported to the Weld County Jail in Greeley, Colorado, where he was booked and held without bond. The investigation did not stop for the night. A team of investigators drove to Survey 319 within the hour. They arrived at the remote oil field site in the dark of a Colorado August night, working from the photograph Chris had marked, and began searching the ground near the oil tank battery. They found the grave. Shanann Watts was recovered from a shallow depression in the earth near the oil tank battery. She had not been laid out or placed with any care. She was face down, curled, as though she had simply been dropped in and the dirt had been pushed over her. The white bedsheet from the Watts master bedroom was at the site. The top sheet that Officer Coonrod had noted was missing during the welfare check that afternoon. It had been used to wrap her body for transport and had been buried with her. It was the physical link between the crime scene at the house on Saratoga Trail and the disposal site 40 miles away. The forensic examination of Shanann's body at the scene produced a finding that was not in any investigator's report from the welfare check that afternoon. The amniotic sac, with the fetus inside, had protruded from her body. Nico Lee Watts, 15 weeks old, already named, already expected by the family that had named him, had not survived his mother. The recovery of Bella and Celeste presented a different and significantly more complicated challenge. The crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319 were 400-barrel industrial vessels used to hold the mixture of oil and water extracted from the surrounding wells. Each tank had a single access point at the top, a hatch opening measuring 8 inches in diameter, 8 inches across, the opening through which a father had placed the bodies of his 3-year-old and 4-year-old daughters. Draining the tanks was required before any recovery could begin. The process was time-consuming and technically demanding. It ran through the night and into August 16th. On August 16th, 2018, the bodies of Bella and Celeste Watts were recovered from 2 separate crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319. Celeste was still wearing her nightgown. She had gone to bed the night before the murders in it. She was wearing it when she was found. Also on August 16th, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Christopher Lee Watts appeared in Weld County District Court for a bond hearing. Bond was denied. He was remanded to the Weld County Jail. On August 17th, all 3 victims were formally identified by the Weld County coroner. On August 20th, at 4 in the afternoon, Watts was formally charged with 9 felony counts, 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation, 2 additional counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of children under the age of 12 by a person in a position of trust, 1 each for Bella and Celeste, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Shanann's father, Frank Razuchek Sr., and her brother, Frankie Razuchek Jr., stood alongside prosecutors at the press conference when the charges were announced. On September 1st, 2018, a funeral service was held for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Pinehurst, North Carolina, not far from Aberdeen, where Shanann had grown up. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rozuchek, and Frankie were present. They buried their daughter and their granddaughters and the grandson who had never taken a breath in the state where Shanann had gone to school, where she had built her first life, and where she had met, as a young woman rebuilding after illness and heartbreak, the man who would one day take everything she had built and bury it in a field 40 miles from home. The autopsy reports for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts were completed and delivered to prosecutors on October 1st, 2018. What those reports contained dismantled, with forensic precision, every single element of the false narrative Christopher Watts had constructed in the interrogation room and delivered to his father. Chris had claimed that Shanann harmed the girls. He had told investigators he had seen her strangling Celeste on the baby monitor. He had told them Bella was already blue when he found her. He had built an account in which Shanann was the initiator of violence, and he was the man who responded to something unbearable. The autopsies told a different story, an unambiguous one. Shanann Watts died from asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The autopsy documented specific physical findings: bruising of the right sternocleidomastoid muscle and bruising on the surface of the right side of the thyroid cartilage. These injuries are consistent with a chokehold applied from behind, with the right side of the victim's neck in the crook of the attacker's right arm. There were no defensive wounds on Shanann's body. She had not fought back. Investigators and analysts who reviewed this finding noted it was entirely consistent with the oxycodone found in her system, a substance her husband had been placing in her drinks for weeks without her knowledge, in doses intended to compromise the pregnancy. Her body had been chemically compromised before August 13th ever arrived. She could not fight back because she was not in a condition to. Celeste Catherine Watts, CE, 3 years old, died from asphyxiation due to manual smothering. Bella Marie Watts, 4 years old, also died from asphyxiation due to manual smothering. But Bella's autopsy contained a finding not present in her sister's. There was physical evidence consistent with resistance. Evidence that she had fought against whoever was covering her airway. Evidence that she had tried to survive what was being done to her. The forensic conclusions were unambiguous on every point that mattered. The nature and manner of each victim's death was entirely inconsistent with the account Chris had given investigators. Shanann's injury pattern was consistent with strangulation from behind by a single attacker, not with a domestic violence scene involving an enraged wife. Celeste and Bella's deaths were both caused by manual smothering applied by hands, not by the strangling motion Chris claimed he had witnessed Shanann performing when he said he found her on the baby monitor. The pathology was specific. The findings were clear. All 3 deaths had been caused by the same individual. The forensic team's conclusion left no room for any alternative reading. The false narrative had been dismantled by the evidence of what had actually been done to each victim's body. The toxicology findings for Shanann also returned the result that had been sitting unexplained in the official record since the autopsy was completed. Oxycodone was present in her system. There was no documented prescription for it, no medical history that accounted for its presence. The finding remained without a complete explanation until Chris himself, in letters written to Sharon Cadle from Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, admitted in writing that he had administered it to her covertly, placed in her drinks over the weeks before August 13th, in an attempt to cause a miscarriage. The admission in the Cadle letters and the oxycodone in the official toxicology report are consistent with each other. The attempt had failed. Shanann had become ill but remained pregnant, and then her husband had found another way to remove the obstacle. Nico Lee Watts presented prosecutors with a legal challenge that the law, as it existed in Colorado at the time of the crime, could not fully address. Under Colorado statute at the time, an unborn child could not be named as a victim of homicide, regardless of gestational age. Prosecutors filed the only charge the law provided that formally acknowledged Nico's death, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. It was not a murder charge. It was the legal mechanism available, the only one, to put his name on the charge sheet and ensure that the 4th life taken in that house on Saratoga Trail was formally recognized in the court record. Nicole Kessinger had cooperated fully with investigators across every stage of the case. She had participated in multiple interviews, had provided documentation, had given agents the affair timeline, the behavioral account of Chris on August 13th, and the specific detail about the stripped bed visible during the FaceTime call. Investigators examined the full scope of her involvement, her communications, her search history, her behavior in the days following the disappearance, and reached a definitive conclusion. She had no role in what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, or Nico. She was never charged with any crime. Take a second here, because if this case is hitting you the way it hits everyone who has followed it closely, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Tell us where in the world you are watching from, and tell us what part of this case you find the most difficult to absorb. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes if you have not already. There is one chapter left. It covers what Chris Watts said from his prison cell in Wisconsin in a 5-hour interview that the investigators who had worked this case for months described as worse than anything they had allowed themselves to imagine. And it covers where everyone in this story stands today, in 2026. You do not want to miss it. On paper, the case was closed. Christopher Watts had been arrested. He had been charged with 9 counts. The bodies had been recovered. The forensic evidence had been gathered, processed, and documented. The investigation had done what investigations are supposed to do. But the investigators who had built this case, Agent Lee, Agent Coder, Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department, had not heard the full truth. What Chris had given them in the interrogation room on August 15th was a confession shaped entirely by self-interest, a version of events designed to minimize his culpability, assign blame to his dead wife, and give investigators enough to close the immediate loop without revealing the full sequence of what had actually happened. The false narrative about Shanann harming the girls had been demolished by the autopsies. But the autopsies could not tell investigators everything. They could not tell them what had happened to Bella and Celeste in specific detail, in what order, in what location, with what the girls had said and what they had known in those final hours. They could not confirm whether the girls had been alive when they left that house. They could not tell anyone what had happened during the 40-mile drive from Saratoga Trail to Survey 319. Those answers existed in only one place, and getting to them would require one more flight to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, to a man serving 3 consecutive life sentences, to one final conversation, a 5-hour one, with a killer who had, until that point, only ever told the version of this story that served himself. By the time November arrived, the prosecution team had been building for a murder trial that everyone expected would take years. Evidence was still being processed. Witnesses had not all been fully interviewed. The kind of thorough, exhaustive foundation that a first-degree murder case of this magnitude demands was being constructed carefully, with the understanding that the process would take the time it needed. Then, on November 6, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts shuffled into a third-floor courtroom at the Weld County District Court in Greeley, Colorado. He was wearing orange jail scrubs and had a protective vest over his chest. A sheriff's deputy walked on either side of him. 60 people were packed into every available seat in the gallery. Shanann's parents and her brother sat in the front row, behind the prosecutors. His voice was shaky and broke at points, but he said the word, guilty. He said it 9 times. 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation. 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, 1 for Celeste. 2 additional counts of first-degree murder for causing the death of a child under the age of 12, while in a position of trust. 1 each for Bella and Celeste. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for Nico. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body for burying Shanann's remains and disposing of the girls' bodies in crude oil storage tanks. 9 counts. 9 times, he said guilty. His voice broke on some of them. The plea deal had one condition. In exchange for those 9 guilty pleas, the Weld County District Attorney would not pursue the death penalty. That condition, and the decision about whether to accept it, did not belong to the prosecution alone. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke confirmed publicly and in detail that before he agreed to the arrangement, he sat with Shanann's family. He said clearly that he would not have accepted the deal without their explicit endorsement. He explained the context he had shared with them, including the extraordinary delays in Colorado's death penalty system at the time, and the case of a man named Nathan Dunlap, convicted and sentenced to death in 1996, who was still alive decades later because of gubernatorial intervention. He gave the family the full picture of what a death penalty pursuit would mean in practical and emotional terms over the years ahead. Shanann's parents, Frank Razuchek Sr. and Sandra Razuchek, the woman the family called Sandy, had been present throughout everything. They had sat with the weight of August 13th every day since it happened, and they sat with the weight of this decision too. Sandy Rzucek spoke, and what she said became, by the account of every person present in those discussions, the single most consequential statement made by any non-investigator throughout the entire case. She said Chris Watts had made the choice to take those lives. She did not want to be in the position of making the choice to take his. That was not a right she wished to exercise. His life, she said, was between him and God, and she prayed that God would have mercy on him. That statement shaped everything that followed. DeRourke described it as the most compelling factor in the decision. He said there was no version of this outcome in which he was going to go against the expressed wishes of a mother who had buried her daughter, her granddaughters, and her unborn grandson. The plea was accepted. After the guilty pleas were entered, DeRourke stood before reporters and addressed the false narrative Chris had tried to construct in the interrogation room, the story in which Shanann had harmed the girls. He said, the spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann, falsely, incorrectly, and frankly a flat-out lie, has been corrected. The spotlight shines directly where it belongs, on him. Sentencing was held on November 19th, 2018. Judge Marcelo Kopkow presided. The courtroom was packed again. Chris sat at the defense table, head down, leg bobbing. Before he heard his sentence, he sat through the victim impact statements. He sat through Frank Rzucek Sr. looking at him and saying, I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every day of your life. He sat through Shanann's family calling him a heartless monster. His own mother told him in a prepared statement that she loved him, while his parents acknowledged that what had happened was not condonable and something they would never get over. Chris's own attorney told Judge Kopkow that her client was devastated, that though his words were hollow, he was sincerely sorry for all of this. When Judge Kopkow asked Chris directly whether he wished to deliver a statement to the court, Chris looked up. He said, No, sir. Those were the only words he spoke during his entire sentencing proceeding. Judge Kopkow then described the case before him. He had handled thousands of cases in his time on the bench. He called this perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that he had ever seen in those thousands of cases. Then he sentenced Christopher Lee Watts. 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, 1 for Celeste. Consecutive, not concurrent. Each one must be completed before the next begins. 3 consecutive life sentences without parole is, in practical and legal terms, an absolute guarantee that no living human being will ever see Christopher Watts walk free. 2 additional life sentences, 1 each for the murders of Bella and Celeste as children under 12 by a person in a position of trust, to be served concurrently alongside the consecutive terms. 48 additional years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, the charge that put Nico's name on the record. 36 additional years for 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. 12 years for each of the 3 people whose remains he had disposed of in a shallow grave and crude oil storage tanks. 5 life sentences. 84 additional years. No parole. No appeal pathway. On December 3rd, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts was transferred out of Colorado. 2 days later, on December 5th, he arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections confirmed to Inside Edition Digital that the Colorado Department of Corrections made the decision to transfer him out of state after a security incident 1 month into his Colorado sentence. His notoriety had made him an immediate and sustained target for violence. In the Weld County Jail during the months leading to sentencing, the facility had to lock down the entire inmate population just to move him down a hallway. He could hear other inmates yelling at him from their cells, telling him in specific terms what they would do to him if given the chance. Wisconsin was the system's way of managing that threat by removing him from the environment where he was most known. Investigators said the guilty plea produced 2 feelings in equal measure: relief that it was over, and a quiet, persistent frustration that it had ended the way it did. The clock had been stopped before all the evidence was fully processed, before every witness had been fully interviewed. And more than that, the story Chris had told in the interrogation room, the false narrative in which Shanann had harmed the girls, had been demolished by the autopsies, but never formally recanted by the man who invented it. He had never told the truth about what actually happened to Bella and Celeste. That was the part that did not sit. In February of 2019, 3 months after the sentencing, with the legal case formally closed, 3 investigators boarded a flight to Wisconsin. Special Agent Graham Coder of the FBI, Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department, the same 3 people who had sat in the interrogation room on August 15th, the same 3 who had watched through the observation glass while Chris whispered to his father in a polo shirt that said, "Papa Ronnie." They flew to Dodge Correctional Institution, not because the law required it. The case was closed. There were no open charges, no pending hearings, nothing legally incomplete. They went because they believed that Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were owed the full truth. And the full truth had not yet been spoken. The interview was conducted on February 18th, 2019. The full audio was released publicly in March of that same year. It lasted 5.5 hours. Chris was brought out to meet them. When he saw who was in the room, he paused for a brief second before recognition showed on his face. He asked how they were doing. He said he had not expected to see them. Agent Coder explained that they were not there about an open investigation. Nothing Chris said could result in additional charges or add a single day to his sentence. He asked Chris if he was available to speak. Chris said, "Definitely." The conversation that followed over the next 5.5 hours covered everything the August 15th confession had deliberately withheld. The first thing Coder addressed was the false narrative. He told Chris they needed him to say on the record that Shanann had not harmed the girls, that the story he had given in the interrogation room, the baby monitor, Shanann strangling Celeste, Bella already blue on her bed, was a lie. Chris confirmed it without hesitation. Shanann did not harm the girls. He recanted it completely and clearly. He said it on record in front of Agent Lee and Agent Coder and Detective Baumhover, and it was documented in full. Then he told them what had actually happened. He described telling Shanann he did not love her anymore. He described the conversation escalating. He described Shanann telling him he would never see the children again. He told investigators he put both of his hands around his wife's neck and strangled her. Every time he thinks about it, he told them, he asks himself, did I know I was going to do that before I got on top of her? He wrapped Shanann in the bedsheet from the master bed. He tried to carry her downstairs. She was too heavy. He dragged her. He bundled her into the back of his truck, covering her face and her feet with garbage bags. Then he described what Bella had seen. Bella watched him carry her mother's body downstairs and load her into the truck. She started crying a little bit, Chris told investigators. She asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" That is when Celeste woke up. He put both girls in the back seat of the truck. Below their feet, on the floor of the cab, was their mother's body. Then he said the thing that reframed everything. Both girls were alive when the truck left Saratoga Trail. They were alive for the entire drive to Survey 319, approximately 1 hour. During the drive, Chris told investigators, the girls dozed off and on and laid in each other's laps. No investigator who worked this case had considered this possibility before the Wisconsin confession. It was not in any report. It was not a scenario that had been formally discussed. When Chris said it in that room on February 18th, the 3 investigators sitting across from him received it in the specific silence that follows information that changes everything you thought you understood. At the oil field site at Survey 319, Chris took Shanann's body out of the truck and placed it on the ground. Both girls were still in the back seat. And then, from inside the truck, they asked him a question. They asked, "What are you doing to Mommy?" He did not answer them. He laid Shanann on the ground. Then he returned to the truck for Celeste. He smothered Celeste first. He used a blanket over her face. Her own blanket, the one she slept with, the blanket that investigators had noted was missing from her bed during the welfare check on August 13th along with Bella's. When he knew Celeste was gone, he carried her body to the first oil tank and placed her through the 8-inch hatch at the top. He dropped her inside. Then he walked back to the truck. Bella had been in the back seat the entire time. She had watched her father walk away with her little sister. She had watched him approach the oil tank. She had watched what happened, And when he returned to the truck and opened the door, she looked at him. She asked, "What happened to Sissa?" And then she asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as she?" Chris told investigators he did not know if he said yes, like a horrible person, or if he just put the blanket over her and began. He could not recall exactly. He said he hears it every day in prison. He said that her final words, the last thing she ever said to him, were, "Daddy, no." He told investigators, "I wasn't thinking. If I was thinking, none of this would have happened. With any partial hint of what I feel for those girls, and what I feel for my wife, none of this would have happened. I wasn't thinking." The Weld County DA's office later described the full 5.5-hour Wisconsin interview as among the most disturbing documents in the case record. Agent Tammy Lee said in documented accounts that the Wisconsin confession was worse than anything she had allowed herself to imagine before walking into that room. She said that when she got home that Friday evening, she kissed her own children, walked upstairs, and collapsed on the floor. She said it was not the facts alone that broke her. It was the hours. It was the tone. It was the gap between what was being described and what the man describing it appeared to feel as he described it. When investigators asked Chris directly whether any part of what he did to the girls was intended as a mercy, whether he had believed he was sparing them from a difficult life without their mother, his answer was immediate. No. He said it was anger. He said he was directing rage at everyone who was in front of him that morning. He was angry at Shanann, angry about the separation, angry about being told he would not see the children. And he took that anger out on everyone in his path. He offered nothing else. DeMichael Rourke said afterward that in most cases, once everything has been documented and the full picture is assembled, you arrive at a sense of the why. You may not agree with it, but you can trace the logic. Here, he said, the why never materialized. The explanation Chris gave, anger taken out on everyone in front of him, did not account for the weeks of planning, the oxycodone, the school call, the realtor call, the deliberate and methodical execution of 4 deaths followed by an ordinary workday. It did not account for any of it in a way that added up. That absence, Rourke said, was what stayed with everyone who worked this case. As of 2000 and 2006, Christopher Lee Watts is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpun, Wisconsin, where he has been since December 5, 2018. He works as a custodian in the facility. He exercises once or twice per day, Monday through Friday, as confirmed by a Wisconsin Department of Corrections spokesperson. He participates in Bible study. He is described by sources as acutely isolated, aware that other inmates regard him as the lowest category of offender, a man who killed his children and frequently express violent intent toward him. He largely avoids eye contact with other inmates. He has put on weight since his incarceration and has lost most of his hair. He has received 2 documented conduct violations at Dodge. The first, in 2020, was for unauthorized forms of communication and unauthorized transfer of property. The second, in 2021, was for disobeying orders and possession of miscellaneous contraband. He keeps photographs of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste in his cell. A source told People magazine that he claims to talk to the photographs every morning and evening and reads books to his daughters. A public petition demanding the removal of those photographs gathered more than 20,000 signatures. The Department of Corrections stated there was no legal basis for removal. The photographs remain. He has maintained correspondence with multiple women during his incarceration. Some send him letters. Some send photographs. He responds to all of them. In 2021, Chris co-authored a self-published book of prayers with a fellow Dodge inmate named Dylan Tallman, a man who had been placed in the neighboring cell to Chris and with whom he grew close. The book was titled Revelation in the Reckoning. Tallman has publicly stated he believes Chris is innocent. In letters obtained by the Daily Mail and News Nation and reported in August and October of 2025, Chris wrote extensively to a female pen pal named Deborah, whose correspondence with him began in 2022. In a letter written in October 2025, he told Deborah, "God had a plan for me. He wants me in prison. This is His will, just like it was His will for Jesus to die for us." He added, "I will never fully understand what Christ went through when He was crucified, but my trials have given me a glimpse of it." He told Deborah he had converted to Christianity in prison, and considered himself a new man. He wrote, "I am not the person who committed those horrible acts." By late 2025, he had written to her that they could not be together, telling her, "I believe that in a different time, I would have been able to be with you, but God has other plans for my life." In an earlier set of letters, he described Nicole Kessinger as a harlot and a Jezebel. He wrote, "I have always taken full responsibility for what I did, even though I was misled by a wicked woman. She was a harlot, a Jezebel who led me astray, who spoke sweet words of destruction, but I will let God have his justice with her. I was weak, and I let her cloud my morals and my judgment." These letters contradict everything he said about Kessinger in the formal investigative record and in the Wisconsin confession, in which he described the relationship as his choice, his pursuit, and something he had willingly continued. In the prison letters, he rewrote that account entirely and placed the blame on a woman who had been deceived by him, who cooperated fully with investigators, and who has spent the years since this case trying to disappear. The family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, was sold on October 17, 2024 for $650,000. The home had originally been listed in April of that year for $775,000. The price was cut multiple times. The seller offered $15,000 toward the buyer's mortgage costs. The final sale price of $650,000 represented a significant discount compared to comparable homes in the Windham Hill subdivision that had not been featured in a Netflix documentary. The exterior of the house has since been repainted from its original color in an apparent effort to alter its appearance. New owners live there now. Nicole Kessinger has not made any public statement since her interview with the Denver Post in November of 2018. Reports as of early 2026 suggest she may be living under a different name, having relocated away from Colorado. Some reports have suggested she entered a witness protection arrangement, though this has never been officially confirmed by any government agency. Shanann Watts said something once, in one of the hundreds of Facebook Live sessions she recorded from her living room in Frederick, talking directly to the camera the way she always did, relaxed, honest, and completely herself. She said, "I believe that everything in life happens for a reason. I also believe that people are placed in our lives for a reason." She said she was addicted to creating memories. She said she wanted to live life to its fullest, every day, without apology. She was 34 years old when she died. She had navigated a lupus diagnosis that had derailed her career and reshaped her 20s. She had rebuilt from bankruptcy. She had built a business, a following, and a public life that looked like the product of someone who refused to be defeated by anything. She had written love letters to a man who threw them in the garbage. She had ordered a book to save her marriage and watched it disappear without comment. She had told her friends she would fight for her daughters if it came to that. She had kept going, all the way up to 1:48 in the morning on August 13, 2018, when she walked through her own front door carrying a suitcase after a long work trip, and the going stopped. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. The family called her Bells. She was quiet and thoughtful, and she waved at the neighbors from across the backyard with a deliberateness that made adults feel genuinely seen. She fought back when someone covered her airway in the back seat of a truck at an oil field 40 miles from home. The autopsy said so. Before that, at the oil site, she asked a question. She asked, "What happened to Sushi?" And then she asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as C?" She was 4 years old. She knew something was wrong. She tried to understand it with the only tool she had. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. C, the firecracker, the belly laugh that filled every room it entered. She had a nut allergy so serious that her mother carried an EpiPen every time they left the house together. She was wearing her nightgown when she was found. She had gone to bed the night before last wearing it, and she had it on still. Nico Lee Watts had a name. He had parents who had announced him on camera with visible joy, who had already decided what to call him, who had already made room for him in the life they were building. He was 15 weeks old and he had a name, and the law that was supposed to protect him did not have a category for what was done to him, so prosecutors used the only mechanism available and put his name on the charge sheet anyway, because his name deserved to be there. The investigators who worked this case, Officer Coonrod, Special Agent Graham Coder, Agent Tammy Lee, Detective Dave Baumhover, and every person from the Frederick Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation who contributed to the 48 hours that closed it, did not fly to Wisconsin in February of 2019 because the law required them to. The case was closed. The sentence was entered. There was nothing legally outstanding. They flew because they believed the 4 people whose names were on those charge sheets were owed the full truth. Not the version that served the man who had taken their lives. The actual truth. Sandy Rzucek stood in a Weld County courtroom in November of 2018 and said she did not want the power to make the choice that Chris Watts had made. She handed that power back. She said his life was between him and God. And then she walked out of that building carrying what this case had left her, the way you carry the unbearable things, not because they become lighter, but because you do not put them down. Frank Rzucek Sr. told the man who killed his daughter, "You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see it every day of your life." Christopher Lee Watts will die at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. 3 consecutive life sentences, 84 additional years. No parole, no release date, no second act. He is 40 years old, and he will die there. He reads books to photographs of the daughters he murdered. He compares his incarceration to the suffering of Jesus Christ. He calls Nicole Kessinger a Jezebel. He calls himself a new man. He said no, sir, when the judge asked if he had anything to say. He had 9 months, from August 13th to November 6th, to decide what he wanted to say. He chose nothing. That is the outcome the law produced. It is not justice for Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. There is no legal sentence that constitutes justice for what was taken from those 4 people in those hours between 1:48 and 5:46 on the morning of August 13th. There is only the law doing what it can, removing the person who did it and making sure he stays removed. That is all that remains. If this case moved you, if any part of what you heard across these 8 chapters stayed with you, share this video. Every person who watches it is one more person who knows their names. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes for a new case every week. We cover these stories with the depth and accuracy they deserve, and we are committed to keeping doing that because of every one of you watching. Drop a comment below. We want to know what you think. Do you believe the account Chris Watts gave in Wisconsin on February 18th, 2019 was the full truth? Or is there still something, some piece of what happened in that house and on that drive and at that oil field that he has never said and never will? We will see you in the next one.